All right, yes, we are doing this. So today we're going to be talking about the CIA and some of the darkest operations that they've ever conducted. And yeah, it's going to be fun. It's going to be really fun. Firstly, I want to thank you guys. We recently just hit 75,000 subscribers. Thank you. It means a lot. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe or the CIA is going to come and get you. And check out some of the other videos if you haven't. Most of them go hand in hand with everything that we talk about. So yeah. Now I always get comments from you guys asking, where's your sources? Where's your sources? And we got them, bro. We got them for this video. In the description below, you'll find a link to a PDF or doc that contains links to everything we're going to be talking about. All of these are declassified documents, that being in the forms of PDFs, .govs, or .edus. So feel free to read over them after or during the discussion of whatever topic we're on. Yeah, but I felt like I had to include sources for this one. Kind of important. I usually don't include sources, I'm not going to lie. I'm kind of lazy. I'm already working a full-time job, so when I finish making a YouTube video, I'm just like, nah, I'm gonna post it. Fuck the sources. But yeah, that's there for you guys, and yeah, let's get into it. CIA, bro. CIA. All right, what's going on? I first wanted to say a few things before we started this video. First off, I am American. I love my country. I just want to get that out the way before we inevitably run into the comments that are like, how dare you disrespect your country? If you don't like it, then you can get out. Now, like many of us who grew up in the United States, we were taught that our government operates with the best intentions, promoting democracy and protecting freedom and defending the values of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all that. But that's not really the whole story. The reality is a lot more complicated. The Central Intelligence Agency, while created in the name of national security, has carried out operations that go far beyond the public image, including murder, torture, kidnapping, psychological warfare, drug experimentation, sexual assault, and even child abuse. So yeah, there's a lot of disturbing stuff we're going to be talking about. I just wanted to give you a warning. Yeah, but I also wanted to get on camera for a video. There's a lot of AI channels and people ask if this channel is AI. And it's not, bro. It's not. I'm a real dude. Yeah, that's really it. I just wanted to say that this video is not like an anti-United States of America video. There's plenty of other countries and other intelligence agencies that have done terrible shit too. Mossad. This is just a history video, and I'm probably going to use this on my thesis. All right. Now we can start. All right, so of course we have to cover just a little bit of history, that being the OSS, or Office of Strategic Services. And this was a World War II era precursor to the CIA. This organization was founded in 1942 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt and headed by William Donovan, and the OSS was created to collect and analyze strategic information for the Joint Chiefs of Staff and to conduct covert operations behind enemy lines. This was just a scrappy experimental agency that was composed of academics, spies, ex-criminals, journalists, filmmakers, and soldiers, and it was essentially anyone who had unique skills or connections that could be leveraged against the Axis powers. Though its mission was wartime intelligence and sabotage, the OSS would quickly expand into psychological warfare, guerrilla training, and black propaganda. They ran assassination programs, plotted to poison or sabotage enemy leaders, and even collaborated with mafia figures like Lucky Luciano to secure US ports against Nazi infiltration. And just for context, if you've ever seen Inglourious Bastards, the group, or the Bastards, they're OSS. That's essentially what they would have looked like. Well, of course it's heavily fictionalized, but that's just a little snapshot of them. 5 years later, in 1947, the Central Intelligence Agency would officially be established on September 18th through the National Security Act of 1947 that was signed by President Harry S. Truman. This act was a sweeping reorganization of U.S. military and intelligence services in the aftermath of World War II. This also created the Department of Defense and the National Security Council. The CIA would go on to replace the OSS. However, unlike the OSS, the CIA was given an open-ended mandate. While its primary role was to, quote, correlate and evaluate intelligence relating to national security, Section 102(d)(4) of the Act states that the CIA was to perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the President or the Director of National Intelligence may direct. And this basically gives either the standing President or the Director of the CIA the ability to allow an operation or not allow an operation to play out. At this point in time, two people have the ability to make an executive decision on what the CIA can and can't do. This is an extremely vague clause that I believe became the legal loophole for decades of covert operations that we're going to be talking about. And from its inception, the CIA was not just equipped with analytical responsibilities, but also operational capabilities that were far more aggressive and far-reaching than any other peacetime agency before it. Within years, they had secured massive funding, often unaccountable and buried in black budgets, allowing them to run these clandestine operations globally with little congressional oversight. Under the leadership of their first civilian director, Allen Dulles, the CIA would evolve into an elite autonomous entity capable of orchestrating coups, assassinations, propaganda campaigns, and psychological operations, all under the banner of anti-communism, which you'll see will become a very common theme. The CIA would quickly become both a powerful foreign policy tool and a controversial symbol of American interventionism, as they would operate in the shadows with a license to act beyond traditional legal and diplomatic constraints. Now, our first operation we're going to be talking about wasn't necessarily created by the CIA, and that's Project Chatter. This was a secret U.S. Navy program that was launched in 1947 as an early Cold War response to intelligence reports that suggested that the Soviet Union, and earlier, Nazi doctors at Dachau, had made breakthroughs in the use of psychoactive drugs for interrogation. This project would be spearheaded by Navy psychiatrist Dr. Charles Savage at the Naval Medical Research Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, and Project Chatter would aim to develop a so-called truth serum that could extract information from subjects without physical coercion. Over its 6-year run from 1947 to 1953, the program would test a variety of substances on both animals and human subjects, including the plant-based alkaloid anabasine, the sedative scopolamine, and the hallucinogen mescaline, and most infamously, lysergic acid diethylamide, also known as LSD. This program would intensify during the Korean War amidst fears of communist brainwashing, but they would fail to produce any reliable truth-inducing compound. Ethical concerns would also mount, especially as Savage and his team administered high doses of mescaline and LSD to military personnel and patients, including those suffering from severe depression, without what would now be considered informed consent. In a 1951 Navy report, Savage admitted to testing LSD on 5 healthy volunteers and 15 depressed patients, escalating doses up to 100 micrograms, which caused extreme anxiety and psychotic-like symptoms in many participants. These experiments demonstrated little therapeutic value and highlighted the disturbing willingness of U.S. military researchers to sacrifice ethics for perceived national security gains. And although it was officially terminated in 1953, Project Chatter's research didn't disappear, as instead it would be absorbed into the CIA's infamous MK-Ultra program, which we'll talk about later, serving as both inspiration and operational foundation for even more invasive, wide-ranging experiments in chemical mind control. Operation Bloodstone would be launched in 1947, and this was a covert U.S. intelligence program that secretly recruited Nazi collaborators, fascists, and anti-communists from Eastern Europe to conduct espionage, sabotage, and psychological warfare against the Soviet Union during the early Cold War. Developed by officials like Frank Wisner of the State Department and later managed by the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination, this operation was designed to weaponize the fanatical anti-Soviet sentiment of former enemy nationals, many of whom, ironically, had direct ties to Nazi intelligence or fascist militias. Displaced persons camps in post-war Europe would become a recruiting ground for thousands of refugees, including former SS affiliates, war criminals, and nationalist fighters from countries like Ukraine, Poland, Latvia, and Estonia. These recruits were trained in spycraft, sabotage, and propaganda operations and were deployed to penetrate communist countries and attempt to gather intelligence, preparing for guerrilla warfare in the event of a Soviet-US conflict. Despite the 1948 Displaced Persons Act banning the entry of Nazi collaborators, the US actively circumvented its own laws, which they brushed aside. Intelligence officer Carmel Offee, who oversaw both Operation Bloodstone and a more well-known Nazi scientist recruitment program, Operation Paperclip, facilitated the entry and use of high-level Nazi-affiliated operatives such as Gustav Hilger and Nicholas Popp, despite their documented complicity in war crimes. Bloodstone assets would actually take part in numerous black operations, including the CIA's failed 1949 insurgency in Albania, where guerrillas attempted regime change and sabotage, and propaganda efforts through fronts like Radio Free Europe and the National Committee for Free Europe.
The freedom-loving people of East Europe have been held captive by the communists since World War II. For the past 14 years, their strongest link with the truth and the free world has been Radio Free Europe. A link you keep strong with your contributions that enable Radio Free Europe to break through the communist lies and distortions.
Declassified records in a 1976 investigation would later reveal that Bloodstone's advisory committee helped establish the CIA's wet work capabilities, which refers to assassinations and kidnappings, and tied the program to broader state-sanctioned violence. This operation had blurred the lines between ideological warfare and moral compromise, laying the groundwork for a wider campaign in which U.S. intelligence employed at least 1,000 ex-Nazis as informants and agents throughout the Cold War, many of whom would have their past concealed or sanitized well into the 1990s. The ethical dissonance of Operation Bloodstone, that being espousing democratic values while embracing former fascists and war criminals, stands as one of the most damning indictments of the American Cold War policy. And most notably, Carmel Affi, a key architect of both Bloodstone and Operation Paperclip, would be dismissed from the CIA in 1950 after his homosexuality would become public knowledge. Yeah. In 1947, the CIA also formally integrated the Gehlen Organization, which was a covert West German intelligence network that was led by former Wehrmacht Major General Reinhard Gehlen, who had served as Hitler's top intelligence officer on the Eastern Front. After Germany's defeat in World War II, Gehlen surrendered to U.S. forces and offered his vast archive on the Soviet Union in exchange for protection and continued employment. Recognizing the strategic value of Gehlen's files and contacts amidst the rising Cold War tensions, the U.S. Army initially employed him and his associates under the OSS framework, which would then evolve into the CIA, and by 1947, the CIA would take full control and funding responsibility for Gehlen's network, allowing him to operate semi-independently in West Germany under American direction. This integration marked one of the CIA's earliest major post-war intelligence alliances and would lay the foundation for the BND, or West Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, which Gehlen himself would later lead. This move was deeply controversial, as the Gehlen organization included hundreds of former Nazi officers, SS members, and war criminals who were granted immunity in exchange for their anti-communist expertise. Some even had ties to Holocaust atrocities, yet the CIA would prioritize Cold War utility over accountability, allowing these individuals to escape denazification and continue operating in positions of power. In 1947, as Syria emerged from French colonial rule and prepared for its first parliamentary elections, the newly formed CIA would quickly identify this country as a strategic Cold War battleground, particularly due to its location as the intended route for the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, or TAP line, which was a vital American-backed project to transport Saudi oil to the Mediterranean. Now, U.S. officials were wary of Soviet influence and British ambitions to incorporate Syria into a Hashemite-led Greater Syria, and the CIA would move swiftly to assert control over the region. Under the guidance of officials like Kermit and Archibald Roosevelt, who operated under diplomatic cover, and CIA officer Miles Copeland, the United States would launch covert efforts to shape Syria's post-independence and political landscape. These operatives would scout pro-Western or American-educated local elites and funneled secret financial and logistical support to hand-picked parliamentary candidates in the July 1947 election, all aiming to marginalize or topple the power of President Shukri al-Quwatli, who is a nationalist leader that was viewed as increasingly resistant to U.S. demands, especially after he hesitated to finalize the TAP line project amidst rising public opposition following the controversial 1947 UN partition of Palestine. The CIA, reportedly also backed by American oil interests like Aramco, sought to police the election and install a pliant government that would greenlight the pipeline indefinitely and align with U.S. geopolitical objectives. However, this effort failed to deliver the desired outcome, as Quwatli retained power through a fragile coalition, and the pipeline agreement would remain stalled. However, if you think the CIA would stop their involvement after losing this election, you are surely mistaken, my friend. The next year, in 1948, Operation Mockingbird would launch under the direction of Frank Wisner, who was the head of the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination. This was a covert initiative designed to manipulate media narratives and wage psychological warfare against communist influence during the early Cold War. With the US locked in a global ideological battle against the Soviet Union, Wiesner orchestrated a sweeping plan to infiltrate and control major domestic and foreign press outlets. He would enlist key media figures such as Washington Post publisher Philip Graham, along with a cadre of journalists and executives, many of whom had backgrounds in wartime intelligence, and all who discreetly collaborated with the agency. By the early 1950s, Wiesner claimed to have effectively owned numerous prominent journalists at institutions like the New York Times, Newsweek, and CBS, who all privately agreed to disseminate CIA-friendly content. In 1951, CIA officer Cord Meyer joined the operation and helped expand its influence into a vast press network, as through direct payments, strategic leaks, and covert relationships, dozens of American reporters, editors, and even media owners became willing or unknown CIA assets. For example, influential syndicated columnist Joseph Alsop, whose columns reached over 300 newspapers, was reportedly under CIA direction, and media moguls such as CBS president William Paley and Time magazine publisher Henry Luce would also cooperate with CIA-backed projects, ensuring editorial loyalty and coverage that aligned with U.S. geopolitical interests. The agency didn't just plant stories, it paid journalists to write entire CIA scripted articles, providing, quote, friendly reporters with classified information to steer their framing, and using funds from other government programs like the Marshall Plan to bribe press personnel and bankroll anti-communist cultural efforts. The influence would also extend internationally as well, with the agency covertly owning or subsidizing scores of foreign media outlets, such as the Rome Daily American, of which it owned a 40% stake, all in order to ensure pro-American editorial lines across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Operation Mockingbird even leveraged these media ties to suppress reporting on CIA misconduct, like its roles in later coups in Iran and Guatemala. And ultimately, this operation weaponized journalism itself as a tool of state power, embedding intelligence operatives into the very institutions meant to hold governments accountable, all while creating an enduring legacy of skepticism towards press independence. In 1948, we'd also see the CIA directly interfere in Italy's April 1948 general elections to prevent the ascendance of the Popular Democratic Front, which was a left-wing coalition dominated by the Italian Communist Party. The United States, under President Harry S. Truman, viewed Italy as a frontline state in the emerging Cold War and feared that a communist victory would shift the country into the Soviet sphere of influence, threatening the broader Western alliance and undermining the recently launched Marshall Plan. Acting on Truman's directive, the CIA channeled millions of dollars into Italy to ensure a decisive win for the Christian Democrats, who were a centrist, pro-Western party led by Alcide de Gasperi. CIA funds were delivered covertly, often in literal suitcases of cash, and used to finance pro-Christian Democrat media campaigns, anti-communist trade unions, youth organizations, and civic groups. The agency would launch an extensive psychological warfare effort that included forged documents, plated newspaper stories, and anti-communist radio broadcasts, and the strategic manipulation of the Catholic Church, leveraging Vatican connections and US-based clergy to issue coordinated denunciations of communism and endorsements of the Christian Democrats. One of the campaign's most notable tactics was the mobilization of Italian Americans, who were encouraged to write millions of letters to relatives in Italy, urging them to vote against the communists. The result of the election was a landslide, as the Christian Democrats secured over 48% of the vote, effectively crushing the Italian Communist Party and cementing Italy's place in the Western Bloc. A parallel but less effort would also unfold at the time in France, where the France Communist Party would be undermined by the CIA, working through front organizations like the National Committee for a Free Europe and covertly funneling resources to anti-communist politicians and media outlets, supporting strikes against the French Communist Party-controlled unions and quietly backing moderate socialist and centrist forces to erode their influence in France. These operations in Italy and France were not only successful in the short term, ensuring pro-Western governments during a critical period, but it also served as a foundational template for the CIA's future election interference strategies across Latin America, Southeast Asia, and beyond. In 1948, we'd also see Operation Gladio, and this was the Italian component of a broader, highly secretive NATO-backed and CIA-sponsored initiative to establish stay-behind armies across Western Europe during the Cold War, ostensibly to prepare for guerrilla resistance in the event of Soviet invasion. Gladio was conceived as a defensive contingency plan. As if Warsaw Pact forces occupied Western Europe, these clandestine units, composed of ex-military personnel, right-wing paramilitaries, and intelligence operatives, would wage sabotage, espionage, and insurgency behind enemy lines. While the rationale for this operation was national security, it would rapidly transform into a domestic political weapon used to manipulate internal affairs, suppress left-wing movements, and influence democratic processes. Under layers of secrecy by the Italian Military Intelligence Agency, or CFAR, in coordination with NATO's Clandestine Planning Committee and Allied Clandestine Committee, Gladio was not accountable to elected governments and was largely unknown to even many high-ranking officials. With logistical and financial support from both the CIA and Britain's MI6, Gladio operatives stockpiled arms, trained recruits, and maintained secret communications networks and formed alliances with far-right elements across Italy. And the true depth of this operation would only come to light in 1990 when Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti admitted its existence, confirming the use of unauthorized, NATO-aligned paramilitary forces embedded within democratic states. This revelation would ignite a political firestorm, especially as evidence would begin to emerge linking Gladio to Italy's years of lead throughout the 1960s to the 1980s, which was a period that was marked by violent unrest, bombings, and assassinations. Controversial allegations would arise that Gladio-linked agents and Italian intelligence officials orchestrated or facilitated false flag terrorist attacks, such as the 1969 Piazza Fontana bombing in Milan, which killed 17 people and injured over 80, in an effort to blame the far left and sow public fear of communist insurrection and justify authoritarian crackdowns. Parliamentary inquiries and journalistic investigations have further implicated Gladio in acts of political manipulation, covert surveillance, and extrajudicial violence, with similar stay-behind operations uncovered in Belgium, France, West Germany, Greece, and Turkey, many of which also displayed troubling ties to neo-fascist groups, death squads, and domestic repression. And while NATO has, of course, acknowledged the existence of these stay-behind networks, they have consistently denied any involvement in terrorism or interference in democratic politics. In 1948, we'd see Project Sign, originally named Project Saucer, and this wasn't done by the CIA, but was a 1948 U.S. Air Force initiative launched under General Nathan Twining to investigate unidentified flying objects, or UFOs, that were considered a potential national security concern during the early Cold War. And though officially disbanded in 1949, its purpose was to gather and evaluate all UFO-related data, concluding that UFOs were real and possibly extraterrestrial. And following Project Sign, the more dismissive Project Grudge would be initiated in February 1949 and lasted until December of that year. However, Grudge, on the other hand, would operate under the assumption that UFOs posed no credible foreign threat and often attributed sightings to mundane phenomena like misidentified aircraft, war hysteria, hoaxes, or psychological disorders, aiming to create a more public paranoia than conduct actual scientific inquiry. And critics like astronomer J. Allen Hynek and former Air Force officer Edward J. Ruppelt would go on to accuse Project Grudge of being more a propaganda effort than an honest investigation, with its only formal report in August of 1949 downplaying UFOs entirely. Again, this wasn't done by the CIA, but the US Air Force, and I just wanted to include this because I thought it was interesting. Yeah. The next year, in 1949, we'd see the CIA's covert involvement in the March 30th, 1949 military coup in Syria, during which Colonel Husni al-Zaim would overthrow the democratically elected government of President Shukri al-Quwatli. Just to recap, if you remember, the post-World War II geopolitical context would see Syria as a newly independent but unstable nation navigating its internal political divisions and Cold War pressures, and the US would view Syria as a potential ally in its anti-communist campaign, but President Quwatli's government was seen as unreliable as they opposed US plans for a regional oil infrastructure, particularly, like we talked about, the Trans-Arabian Pipeline, or TAP line, and they were also increasingly sympathetic to leftist and nationalist movements. CIA officers Stephen Meade and Miles Copeland, stationed in Damascus under diplomatic cover, would cultivate relationships with Colonel Husni al-Zaim and other Syrian military officers. And while the CIA did not engineer the coup from scratch, they provided critical encouragement, strategic advice, and approval, signaling to Zaim that the takeover would not meet US resistance, effectively greenlighting the operation. After seizing power, Zaim's regime would move swiftly to align with American interests, as ironically within days, he would approve the Trans-Arabian Pipeline Agreement, advancing key US and Saudi oil interests in the region. He also initiated peace overtures with Israel, arrested several Syrian Communist Party members, and banned political opposition, all moves that were welcomed by the United States. However, Zaim's government would prove extremely short-lived, as his autocratic style and disregard for Syria's political factions and inability to deliver reforms would lead to growing domestic discontent. And less than 5 months after taking power, Zaim would be overthrown and executed by rival officers in August of 1949. Despite its brief duration, this 1949 coup would mark a turning point in U.S. foreign policy, as it was the first confirmed CIA role in toppling a foreign government, and it would go on to establish a model for future covert operations that we'll talk about later in this video. This coup, however, also deeply impacted Syrian political stability, as it ushered in a long era of military coups and anti-American sentiment. This operation also demonstrated how short-term strategic gains like pipeline access were often prioritized over democratic legitimacy, a pattern that the CIA would repeat throughout the Cold War. And like I said, this would set the tone for decades of American involvement in Middle Eastern power politics, where covert regime changes would become a favored, volatile tool. Beginning around 1949, the CIA would also begin establishing a network of front companies, as these were corporate entities that appeared legitimate but were secretly owned or controlled by the agency. These companies served as logistical arms for covert operations, particularly in regions where direct U.S. military involvement would have been politically or diplomatically sensitive. And among one of the most prominent of these was Air America, founded in 1950, but born out of earlier CIA aviation ventures like Civil Air Transport, or CAT, a Chinese airline that was acquired by the CIA during the Chinese Civil War. Air America would operate primarily in Southeast Asia during the Cold War and was used extensively during the Vietnam War, Laos conflict, and secret war in Cambodia and Laos. The airline would transport everything from troops and weapons to aid workers and refugees, while also providing cover for clandestine U.S. personnel and paramilitary missions. And on paper, Air America was a civilian charter airline. However, in practice, it was a covert air force, enabling the U.S. to wage proxy wars and support friendly regimes without direct military deployment. The darker side of these front companies would lie in the allegations of drug trafficking. Multiple journalists, whistleblowers, and even former Air America pilots have accused the airline of turning a blind eye or even actively facilitating the transport of opium and heroin from Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle. Laos, Thailand, and Burma, now Myanmar, were key hubs of global heroin production, and local warlords and anti-communist militias, many of whom were armed and supported by the CIA, would finance their operations through the drug trade, and Air America would be allegedly used to move these drugs under the guise of transporting medical supplies or humanitarian aid. The CIA has always denied institutional involvement in drug trafficking, and multiple U.S. Senate investigations, including the 1975 Church Committee, would raise concerns about the agency's complicity or willful ignorance. And Air America would eventually cease their operations in 1976. But this was just one of many CIA front companies, including Southern Air Transport, Evergreen International Aviation, and Zenith Technical Enterprises, all of which played roles in facilitating covert action globally. These front companies gave the CIA plausible deniability, financial flexibility, and physical reach, creating a parallel infrastructure for shadow wars, regime change, arms deals, and yes, in some cases, drug trafficking. The next year in 1950, we'd see the CIA launch an expansive and covert campaign, also known as the Cultural Cold War, which was a strategic effort to combat Soviet influence not only through espionage and elections, but by dominating the ideological battlefield of global culture. Central to this campaign was the Congress for Cultural Freedom, or CCF, which was a CIA-backed front founded in 1950 and based in Paris, which operated in over 35 countries under the guise of promoting intellectual freedom and liberal democratic values. In reality, the Congress for Cultural Freedom was secretly funded through CIA-controlled conduits like the Ford Foundation and Farfield Foundation, and was tasked with promoting anti-communist thought and Western cultural superiority across a variety of mediums. The agency orchestrated everything from highbrow literary magazines, which published essays attacking Soviet repression. They even organized international academic conferences, symphony tours, and avant-garde art exhibitions aimed at intellectual elites and middle-class tastemakers, as these efforts would promote the narrative that Western democracies, particularly the United States, fostered creativity, free expression, and moral clarity, in stark contrast to the censorship and artistic stagnation of the USSR's socialist realism. Among the most ambitious and symbolic operations was the CIA's covert funding of the 1954 animated adaptation of George Orwell's Animal Farm. It was produced by animators John Hylas and Joy Batchelor, and the film was financed through a CIA front company, with Orwell's widow, Sonia Orwell, unknowingly selling the rights to U.S. intelligence operatives. The agency intervened in the screenplay, altering the novel's ambiguous ending to depict the animals triumphantly overthrowing the pigs, thus delivering a neatly packaged anti-communist parable suitable for Cold War messaging. Simultaneously, the CIA sponsored American abstract expressionism that was championed by artists like Jackson Pollock, William de Kooning, and Mark Rothko, not for their aesthetics, but for their ideological symbolism. Chaotic, expressive, and individualistic art that embodied Western freedom and contrasted with the rigid, state-mandated art of the Soviet bloc. These exhibitions were often held across Europe and were organized with the help of museums and curators who were completely unaware of the CIA's involvement. The agency also funded cultural programming, such as the global tours of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, inserting American cultural prestige into international soft power diplomacy. And while these operations successfully rebranded the West as a global epicenter of artistic and intellectual innovation, they were based on deception, as none of the audiences, or even many of the participants, even knew they were consuming or producing CIA-sponsored content. The exposure of these activities in the late 1960s would trigger public outrage and intense scrutiny, particularly among intellectuals and artists who felt betrayed by the covert manipulation of their work for propaganda purposes. And the legacy of the cultural Cold War would endure as a vivid example of how the Cold War was not just fought with missiles and spies, but with books, paintings, films, and concerts, transforming culture into one of the most subtle yet potent weapons in the geopolitical arsenal of the 20th century. In 1950, we'd see Operation Sea Spray, and I want to clarify that this was a U.S. Navy operation, not CIA, but I felt like I had to include this one just because of the context. And this was a biological warfare experiment conducted in September 1950, in which the bacteria Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigi were released from a ship onto the San Francisco Bay Area to study the city's vulnerability to bioweapon attacks. Monitors across 43 sites confirmed that nearly all of San Francisco's 800,000 residents were exposed to potentially infectious doses. And shortly after the test, 11 patients at Stanford Hospital developed rare and severe urinary tract infections. One of them, Edward J. Nevin, would die from complications, prompting speculation that the experiment was to blame, though a direct link was never proven. And despite the unusual nature of the outbreak documented in medical literature and the rise of pneumonia cases in the city, the Army never alerted public health authorities before the release and would even later deny responsibility during the 1977 Senate hearings. Nevin's family would sue the federal government for negligence, but the courts ruled against them, and the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the case. The operation was later revealed to be one of 239 open-air biological tests that were conducted between 1949 and 1969, 80 of which used live bacteria, as similar secret experiments were carried out in Key West, Panama City, Minnesota, and major U.S. cities. Oh yeah, man. Oh yeah, we're getting deep, aren't we? The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 would mark the CIA's first experience in operating in an active war zone. However, this also exposed the agency's deep flaws in intelligence, tradecraft, and preparedness for full-scale conflict. As despite increasing Cold War tensions, the CIA failed to predict the North Korean invasion of South Korea on June 25, 1950, which was one of the most catastrophic early blunders in the agency's history. Analysts underestimated troop movements along the 38th parallel, and internal assessments dismissed the possibility of imminent war. And the failure had immediate consequences as US and South Korean forces were caught off guard. And even as the war progressed, the agency remained poorly equipped to provide real-time battlefield intelligence, as they had a lack of fluent Korean speakers, weak regional networks, and limited understanding of North Korean society and politics that severely crippled the CIA's effectiveness during the conflict. Perhaps one of the most glaring and tragic failures involved the CIA's guerrilla warfare and infiltration campaigns, as in collaboration with US military intelligence and South Korea's National Intelligence Service, the CIA recruited, trained, and deployed thousands of South Korean agents into the north with the goal of conducting sabotage, gathering intelligence, and inciting local resistance. These agents were parachuted in, sent over land, or inserted by boat into North Korean territory, and the results were disastrous. According to declassified reports in U.S. military special operations history, success was nearly zero, with the overwhelming majority of agents being captured, killed, or turned into double agents. North Korea's counterintelligence and tight social control made covert ops nearly impossible. Furthermore, many of the agents were given only minimal training, lacked proper communications equipment, and were sent in with outdated intelligence or no local contacts. The scope of failure was so severe that it led to internal reviews within the CIA and Pentagon and highlighted serious deficiencies in language proficiency, cultural knowledge, coordination between agencies, and operational discipline. This was an embarrassment to the agency. However, in the aftermath, these lessons would contribute to the creation of more professional paramilitary units and eventually the CIA's Special Activities Division. The agency's involvement in the Korean War would become a cautionary tale that covert action without deep regional expertise is a recipe for disaster. We'd see Project Artichoke be launched in the early 1950s and formally become active from 1951 to 1956, and this was one of the CIA's earliest, most disturbing mind control experiments. It evolved from an earlier effort called Project Bluebird and was managed by the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence and Security Office. The central goal of Artichoke was to determine whether agents could manipulate, control, or extract information from individuals through hypnosis, forced drugging, and psychological coercion, even to the point of creating involuntary assassins or Manchurian candidates. This involved interrogating prisoners, foreign nationals, and sometimes unwitting U.S. citizens to study how memory could be erased, behavior modified, and resistance broken. Artichoke experiments often used LSD, scopolamine, sodium pentothal, and mescaline, sometimes in combination, all in order to induce altered mind states or amnesia. Hypnosis was employed not just as a tool for interrogation, but as a method to implant false memories or suggestions, such as compelling a subject to perform acts that they wouldn't normally consider, including acts of violence or sabotage. Now, of course, the ethical violations of Artichoke were substantial and foreshadowed the abuses of Project MKUltra, which would absorb many of its methods and personnel, and Artichoke experiments would be carried out in detention centers overseas in places like Western Europe and Asia, as well as domestic CIA facilities, and in some cases, prisoners were subjected to days-long interrogations under drug-induced confusion, sleep deprivation, and psychological stress. Although no documented evidence shows that they successfully created an actual programmed killer, Artichoke would, like I said, lay the groundwork for later, more extensive behavioral modification programs. And internal CIA records suggest that by 1956, the project would be phased out and folded into MKUltra. I just wanted to include this one because it's kind of funny. But in the early 1950s, during the height of the Cold War, and in the midst of the Hook Balahap or Hook insurgency in the Philippines, the CIA, working through U.S. military psychological operations units, reportedly employed an unconventional tactic rooted in local folklore, as they staged a fake aswang attack, or a vampire-like creature in Filipino mythology. The operation, often attributed to CIA operative Edward Lansdale, aimed to exploit the superstitions of rural populations and guerrilla fighters themselves. And according to Lansdale's own memoirs and accounts by contemporaries, operatives would drain the blood from a Huck soldier's corpse and puncture the neck with 2 small holes to simulate a vampire attack, then leave the body in a conspicuous location, leading to rumors of a supernatural predator that would quickly spread, effectively sowing fear among the superstitious guerrillas and driving them to abandon their areas in which they inhabited. And though difficult to fully verify due to the nature of many psychological warfare efforts and the absolute insanity of this, Lansdale's writings and declassified military reports confirm that psychological manipulation using native legends was indeed part of counterinsurgency strategy used overseas. In 1952, we'd see Project HTLINGUAL, which was a highly classified CIA operation aimed at intercepting, opening, and reading private mail sent between the United States and Soviet Union, as well as mail to and from China and other communist bloc countries. The project originally began under the name Sprinter, which was a post-surveillance program that intended to identify possible Soviet espionage activities or communist sympathizers inside the United States. By 1955, it was rebranded as HTLINGUAL and expanded significantly, though it was Framed as a foreign intelligence initiative, HTLINGUAL quickly evolved into a massive domestic spying operation, violating both privacy rights and U.S. postal laws. The CIA conducted the project with the quiet cooperation of the U.S. Postal Service, which allowed the agency access to international mail centers in cities like New York and San Francisco. Initially, HTLINGUAL only logged metadata such as names, return addresses, and routing info, but it would escalate to the physical opening of over 200,000 letters without warrants between 1953 and 1973. Such targets included spies, journalists, peace activists, and even prominent politicians. The most disturbing aspect of this project was how broadly and indiscriminately it was applied. High-profile Americans, including Senator Frank Church, civil rights leaders, and even the mother of Martin Luther King Jr., had their mail secretly read. The CIA also shared intercepted content with the FBI, which they used to build files on U.S. citizens for domestic surveillance under COINTELPRO. And although the CIA was legally barred from domestic operations, HTLINGUAL operated in the shadows for over 2 decades until it was finally exposed in the 1970s. The program would become a central focus of the 1975 Church Committee hearings, which revealed how deeply embedded the CIA had become in unconstitutional domestic spying. The CIA would justify its actions by citing national security threats during the Cold War, but of course critics viewed HTLINGUAL as a gross abuse of power and a clear violation of the Fourth Amendment, and the operation would be officially terminated in 1973, shortly after the resignation of CIA Director Richard Helms. Aleksandras Lileikis was a Lithuanian national and former Nazi collaborator, and became one of the most controversial figures linked to early CIA recruitment in the Cold War. During World War II, Aleksandras served as the chief of the Lithuanian security police in Vilnius under Nazi occupation, where he directly collaborated with the SS and Gestapo. According to documentation later made public, Aleksandras personally signed orders that handed over at least 75 Jews, including women and children, to Nazi death squads, contributing to the Holocaust in Lithuania, where over 90% of the pre-war Jewish population was exterminated. Following the defeat of Nazi Germany, Aleksandras fled Europe and found his way to Germany's American-occupied zone, where many Eastern European exiles congregated during the early Cold War. And despite a record of war crimes, Aleksandras would be recruited by the CIA in 1952, being seen as a valuable asset in the effort to gather intelligence on Soviet activities and anti-communist movements in Eastern Europe. The CIA's decision to recruit this man would reflect the broader Cold War strategy in which anti-communist utility frequently outweighed moral considerations, and at the time, the US was rapidly expanding its intelligence network in Eastern Europe and believed that figures like Aleksandras, who had deep connections in local communities and an intensive hatred for the Soviet regime, could serve as effective informants or operatives. Internal CIA documents, declassified decades later, show that by 1953, the agency was fully aware of Aleksandras' Nazi affiliations and his role in persecuting Jews, yet protected him and even blocked efforts to deport him when questioned by the U.S. immigration authorities. The CIA would ultimately drop Aleksandras as an active source, but allowed him to immigrate to the United States in 1955, where he quietly lived for decades, working as a translator in Massachusetts. And it wasn't until the 1990s, after renewed Holocaust investigations and document declassification, that his past would be resurfaced and revealed to the public. In 1996, the U.S. government would revoke his citizenship, and in 1997, he would return to Lithuania to face charges of genocide, and he would die the next year in 2000 before his trial concluded. In 1953, we'd see Operation Ajax be carried out, which was one of the CIA's first major successes in orchestrating a regime change and one of its most infamous operations. This operation targeted Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had been democratically elected and gained massive popularity for nationalizing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AIOC, which was a move that threatened British economic interests and Western control over Iranian oil. The British government, alarmed by the loss of its oil monopoly and falsely linking Mossadegh with communism, would appeal to the United States for help. And initially hesitant, the Eisenhower administration approved the plan amidst growing Cold War paranoia. The CIA, under Director Allen Dulles and led in the field by operative Kermit Roosevelt Jr., would launch Operation TP Ajax in August 1953, working closely with British intelligence, or MI6. The plan involved bribing Iranian officials, recruiting military officers, and spreading anti-Mohammad Mossadegh propaganda through press and clergy, and engineering public unrest via paid mobs in the streets of Tehran. After a failed first attempt, A second coup effort would succeed on August 19th, when military forces loyal to the Shah overthrew Mossadegh, arrested him, and restored Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the pro-Western Shah of Iran, to absolute power. The aftermath of this operation had long-lasting consequences. In the short term, the coup restored Western access to Iranian oil and quickly turned Iran into a staunch U.S. ally during the Cold War. However, the Shah's return marked the beginning of an increasingly authoritarian regime that was backed by American military and economic aid. With CIA assistance, the Shah established SAVAK, which was Iran's brutal internal security and intelligence agency, who would become notorious for torture, surveillance, censorship, and the imprisonment of political dissidents. While Operation Ajax was initially hailed in Washington as a successful example of covert power projection, it sowed deep resentment among Iranians, as many viewed it as a foreign assault on their democracy and sovereignty. Over the next 2 decades, anti-American sentiment festered under the Shah's oppressive rule, which ultimately culminated in the 1979 Islamic Revolution, during which the monarchy would be overthrown and the US-backed regime would be replaced by theocratic leadership under Ayatollah Khamenei. And the hostage crisis that followed this, and the decades of enmity between Iran and the United States, can all be traced directly back to the events of 1953. And Operation Ajax is now widely regarded by historians as a textbook case of short-term strategic gain with catastrophic long-term fallout. Frank Olson was a U.S. Army biochemist and CIA consultant whose mysterious death in 1953 will become one of the earliest scandals involving the CIA's secretive behavior in unethical human experimentation. Frank Olson worked at Fort Detrick in Maryland, where he specialized in aerosolized biological weapons as a part of the U.S. Army's top-secret Special Operations Division. In this role, he was affiliated with the CIA's technical services staff, and he became involved in Project MK Naomi, which was a biological warfare research program conducted in parallel with MK Ultra. In November 1953, Olson would attend a retreat at a cabin in Deep Creek Lake, Maryland, with several CIA colleagues. During the meeting, he was secretly dosed with LSD by his supervisors, including Sidney Gottlieb, without his knowledge, as part of MK Ultra experiments testing the effects of psychoactive drugs on unwitting subjects. Over the next several days, Olson began experiencing extreme psychological distress as he became anxious, paranoid, and convinced he made a terrible mistake by working for the CIA. His family and later reports suggest Olson may have had a moral crisis after witnessing or learning details about CIA experiments involving torture, biological warfare, and the use of lethal pathogens. And just days later, on November 28, 1953, Olson would fall to his death from the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel in New York City. The CIA initially claimed it was a due to depression, but decades later, mounting evidence would point to a more sinister possibility. In 1975, the Rockefeller Drug Commission exposed Frank Olson being dosed by LSD, and the CIA would admit to his drugging, offering a settlement to his family. However, suspicions would deepen as in the 1990s, Olson's body was exhumed and forensic pathologists found blunt force trauma to the head that suggested that he may have been knocked unconscious and pushed. His son would spend years investigating the case and believed that his father was murdered, possibly to prevent him from exposing the CIA's involvement in illegal biological experiments and covert assassinations. Despite all this, Olson's case remains one of the most disturbing chapters in CIA history, as it's a cautionary tale about the agency's early reliance on non-consensual human experimentation and psychological manipulation. In 1954, we'd see Operation Acoustic Kitty, and this is one of the CIA's most bizarre and ill-fated espionage experiments that was conceived during the height of Cold War paranoia. The project aimed to create a mobile audio surveillance device using a live cat, and the plan involved surgically implanting a microphone in the cat's ear canal, a transmitter in its skull, and a wire antenna along its spine and tail, effectively turning the animal into a 4-legged recording device capable of eavesdropping on Soviet officials without arousing suspicion. The project cost an estimated $10 to $20 million, involving teams of veterinarians, technicians, behaviorists, and handlers to develop the technology and train the cats to move toward specific human targets on command. Despite years of R&D, Acoustic Kitty was a failure. The first real-world field test occurred outside the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. in 1967, where the feline agent was released with the objective of approaching 2 Soviet diplomats. However, the cat reportedly wandered into the street and was almost immediately struck and killed by a taxi. Yeah. Yeah. Rest in peace. In 1954, we'd see Operation WASHTUB, which was a CIA-orchestrated false flag operation designed to fabricate evidence of Soviet involvement in Guatemala in order to justify an impending US-backed coup. As a part of the broader Operation PBSUCCESS, which aimed to overthrow Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz, WASHTUB involved planning a fake Soviet arms cache in neighboring Nicaragua. The goal was to manufacture proof that Guatemala was becoming a communist beachhead in the Western Hemisphere, and the CIA would covertly bury crates of Soviet-style weapons on the Nicaraguan coast, and once the arms were discovered, quote unquote, by Nicaraguan authorities who were cooperating with the CIA under dictator Anastasio Somoza Garcia, they publicly announced the find and claimed it was part of a secret communist plot involving Guatemala. And the US government and media would quickly amplify this narrative to build support for intervention. And declassified documents would later confirm that Operation WASHTUB was entirely fabricated with no actual Soviet involvement, and the operation was just one component of a larger CIA psychological warfare campaign to discredit Arbenz and create a pretext for military action. Now, as we discussed, we'd also see Operation PBSUCCESS carried out in 1954, which was, again, a covert CIA mission to overthrow the democratically elected President Jacobo Arbenz of Guatemala. Now, Arbenz himself had come to power in 1951 with a reformist agenda that included major land redistribution aimed at alleviating rural poverty and weakening the dominance of large landowners. His more controversial move was Decree 900, a 1952 law that expropriated unused land from large estates, including over 400,000 acres from the US-based United Fruit Company, and redistributed it to poor farmers. The United Fruit Company, which had connections in Washington, including ties to Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles, both of whom who had worked for the firm's law group, would go on to lobby heavily for US intervention, framing Arbenz policies as communist-aligned. Though Arbenz was not a communist, the Eisenhower administration accepted this narrative. The CIA would launch Operation PBSUCCESS with a budget of $7 million, deploying propaganda, psychological warfare, diplomatic pressure, and a small force of exiled Guatemalan rebels trained and armed by the US, and the operation would be run by CIA officer David Atlee Phillips and Field Commander Carlos Castillo Armas, who led the group. The campaign combined radio propaganda, sabotage, and carefully engineered perception of an unstoppable rebel force to break the morale of Arbenz military, and on June 27, 1954, under pressure from the destabilized military and fearing full-scale US invasion, Arbenz would resign and fled the country. Carlos Castillo Armas would be installed as the president, immediately reversing the land reforms and beginning a campaign of political repression. The coup would mark a turning point in Latin America, as it demonstrated the CIA's willingness to intervene in sovereign nations to protect their corporate and geopolitical interests, like we've seen before, under the guise of anti-communism. But the long-term fallout was catastrophic. The coup would completely destroy Guatemala's democratic institutions, ushering a series of US-backed military dictatorships and plunging the country into a 36-year civil war that left over 200,000 people dead or disappeared, many of them being indigenous civilians that were targeted in state-led massacres that have since been classified as genocide, all ushered in by the CIA. Project MK Ultra was officially sanctioned in 1953, however, it would become fully operational by 1954. This was the CIA's most notorious program of mind control and behavioral experimentation. It was led by Sidney Gottlieb, head of the CIA's Technical Services Division, and this project aimed to explore ways to manipulate human consciousness, extract information through chemical or psychological coercion, and potentially create brainwashed agents or assassins. The program was launched during the height of Cold War paranoia, with fears that the Soviets, Chinese, or North Koreans were using advanced mind control techniques on American POWs. Backed by CIA Director Allen Dulles, the project received virtually unlimited funding and zero oversight, allowing it to operate with near total secrecy for 2 decades. And researchers would test a wide range of methods, including LSD, mescaline, barbiturates, hypnosis, electroconvulsive therapy, sensory deprivation, and sleep manipulation, all in hopes of discovering a truth serum or other techniques for erasing or rewriting memories. The program operated through dozens of sub-projects in the US and Canada, often using front organizations, universities, hospitals, and prisons to conduct experiments, frequently without informed consent. Many of MK Ultra's test subjects were prisoners, mental patients, drug addicts, and other vulnerable individuals. And in some cases, subjects were administered powerful hallucinogens like LSD without their knowledge and then monitored for behavioral changes. At the times, the experiments crossed into outright torture, including prolonged isolation, physical abuse, and psychological trauma. One of the most infamous deaths associated with this project was that of Frank Olson, which we talked about, who was unknowingly dosed with LSD and later fell from a hotel window in 1953. This program also funded efforts like Operation Midnight Climax, in which sex workers on CIA payroll would lure unsuspecting men into safe houses where they were secretly drugged and observed behind one-way mirrors. MK Ultra continued into the early 1970s until it was shut down in 1973 by the CIA director Richard Helms, who also ordered the destruction of most records, making a full accounting of the program's scale completely impossible. And MK Ultra would be publicly exposed in 1975 during the Church Committee hearings, which revealed not only its existence, but the profound ethical and legal violations committed in the name of national security. In 1955, we'd see MK Delta, which would be approved that year, and this was a highly secretive sub-program under MK Ultra. And while MK Ultra focused on research and experimentation with psychoactive drugs and psychological techniques, MK Delta was specifically created to apply these methods in covert field operations abroad. MK Delta authorized the overseas use of biologically and chemically active materials, including LSD, mescaline, scopolamine, and other substances that could alter perception, incapacitate individuals, or extract information through chemical means. These materials were meant to be used on foreign nationals, often without their knowledge, in real-world scenarios like interrogations, sabotage, psychological warfare, and even assassination support. A 1977 Senate investigation noted that MK Delta served as the, quote, delivery mechanism for field use of these drugs developed under MK Ultra, and that the substances could be administered openly or surreptitiously via injections, food, drink, aerosols, or contact poison. Basically, this project was formed in connection with MK Ultra, as if MK Ultra ever came up with this truth serum or psychological technique, this was going to be applied overseas against what would most likely be prisoners or people being interrogated, and maybe even political opponents. But yeah. In 1956, the CIA would develop a covert plan known as Operation Straggle to overthrow the Syrian government, which U.S. officials viewed as uncooperative with Western anti-communist efforts and increasingly aligned with Soviet interests. Initially, the operation proposed utilizing the Iraqi army to facilitate a coup, but focus soon shifted to recruiting agents and collaborators within Syria itself. On July 1st, 1956, CIA official Archibald Roosevelt and National Security Council member Wilbur Crane Eveland and former Syrian minister Mikhail Bey Ilyan met in Damascus to finalize the plan for a US-backed military takeover. Scheduled for October 25th, the plot called for Syrian military forces loyal to Colonel Kobani to seize control of major cities, that being Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and Hama, as well as the country's border posts with Jordan, Iraq, and Lebanon, effectively sealing Syria's frontiers while state-run radio stations would broadcast news of the new regime. Armored units were to be deployed across Damascus to assert dominance, after which Mikhail Bey Ilyan would assemble a hand-picked civilian government whose members would be informed only a week prior to the coup in order to prevent leaks. The CIA financed the operation with 500,000 Syrian pounds, or around $167,000, and pledged further support to the post-coup regime. Although Secretary of State John Foster Dulles publicly distanced himself from any coup activity, he privately endorsed the plan and recommended it to President Eisenhower. However, the operation was abruptly postponed for 5 days due to rising tensions in the region, and on October 31st, just as the Suez Crisis erupted with Israel, Britain, and France launching military action against Egypt, John Foster Dulles would tell his brother, CIA Director Allen Dulles, that attempting to execute Straggle under such volatile circumstances would be a mistake. So, Mikhail Bey Ilyan would withdraw himself, arguing that toppling the Syrian government during what appeared to be an Israeli war of aggression would be politically disastrous. And National Security Council member Wilbur Crane Eveland later speculated that the British may have intentionally timed the Suez invasion to sabotage this US-led coup and divert American attention away from criticizing their actions in Egypt, and the plans for Operation Straggle would disintegrate. In the wake of China's occupation of Tibet in 1950, the CIA would begin covert operations to support the Tibetan resistance against the Chinese, particularly following the outbreak of armed uprisings in 1956. As a part of its broader Cold War strategy to undermine communist regimes, the CIA sought to destabilize China from within by backing ethnic and nationalist insurgencies in its border regions. Tibetan resistance fighters, many of them from the Khampa ethnic group in eastern Tibet, began waging guerrilla war against Chinese forces, and by late 1956, the CIA began supplying them with weapons, communications gear, and funding. In a secret operation known as Saint Circus, the CIA also trained select Tibetan fighters as Tibetan recruits were airlifted out of their region via India and Nepal, trained in sabotage, guerrilla warfare, and radio operations, and then parachuted back into Tibet. Despite initial enthusiasm for these efforts, this mission ultimately failed to achieve its strategic goals, as the resistance was vastly outgunned and outnumbered by Chinese forces, who responded with overwhelming military force and severe crackdowns on Tibetan villages suspected of aiding insurgents. The Chinese government launched brutal counterinsurgency operations, resulting in widespread civilian casualties, destruction of monasteries, and the suppression of Tibetan culture and religious life. And though the CIA continued supporting the Tibetan exile movement into the 1970s, by 1974, the US withdrew its operational support as part of its détente with China under President Nixon. COINTELPRO was a covert FBI operation that was officially launched in 1956 under the direction of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Its stated goal was to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, or otherwise neutralize domestic political organizations deemed subversive or radical. Initially targeting the Communist Party of the USA, COINTELPRO would quickly expand its scope to include civil rights activists, anti-Vietnam War protesters, Black liberation movements, Puerto Rican independence advocates, socialist groups, and even feminist and Native American organizations. The FBI viewed these movements, many of which were peaceful or legally protected forms of dissent, as existential threats to the American political order, particularly during the Cold War climate of paranoia. COINTELPRO operations would include wiretapping, mail tampering, infiltration of meetings, and the deployment of fake informants and provocateurs in order to sow internal discord. Agents created fake documents, spread rumors, and attempted to pit movement leaders against one another, and this was done without judicial oversight and with little regard for legality or civil rights. Among its most infamous targets were the leaders of civil rights movements, particularly Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whom Hoover considered a dangerous figure. And the FBI would wiretap Dr. King, send him anonymous letters attempting to blackmail and discredit him, including a notorious 1965 letter urging him to commit suicide, and even tried to undermine his influence with the broader movement. Similarly, COINTELPRO targeted the Black Panther Party, labeling them a violent revolutionary group and working to dismantle their community programs, like free breakfast initiatives. For example, in 1969, Chicago Panther leader Fred Hampton would be killed in a police raid coordinated with federal informants, which was widely seen as part of the COINTELPRO agenda, and the program itself would remain secret until 1971, when a group of activists would break into the FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and leak documents to the press. Further investigations, including the 1975 Church Committee, revealed the full extent of COINTELPRO's abuses, leading to public outcry and calls for reform. And while COINTELPRO was officially terminated in 1971, its legacy endures as a cautionary tale of unchecked domestic surveillance and the weaponization of federal power against political dissent. The 1956 Hungarian Uprising was a spontaneous, nationwide revolt against Soviet-imposed policies and the communist government in Hungary, beginning on October 23, 1956. It was one of the most significant anti-Soviet movements in the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War, as thousands of Hungarians took to the streets demanding democratic reforms, freedom of speech, and withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. Radio Free Europe, or RFE, was a CIA-funded broadcast network that would play a crucial and controversial role in this uprising, as it was established in the early 1950s as part of the CIA's psychological warfare strategy to counter Soviet influence, and during the uprising, RFE's Hungarian language broadcast would intensify dramatically, airing impassioned messages that praised the revolution and even encouraged armed resistance, suggesting that continued defiance might lead to Western military support or intervention. Although there was no official US policy to intervene in Hungary militarily, many Hungarian listeners interpreted the RFE's tone and messaging as implied promises of help from NATO or the United States, and the RFE would continue to operate under the CIA's broader directive to stir dissent in Soviet-aligned states. However, when the Soviet Union would respond with overwhelming force, invading Hungary on November 4th, 1956, and crushing the revolution, over 2,500 Hungarians would be killed, and tens of thousands would be arrested or fled into exile, and no Western military assistance ever came, leaving Hungarian insurgents to face the consequences alone. The US limited its response to verbal condemnation and humanitarian aid for refugees, and in the aftermath, Radio Free Europe and the CIA would come under intense criticism, not only from neutral observers, but also from some within the US government, as critics accused the agency of engaging in irresponsible psychological warfare, fueling false hopes, and essentially inciting a doomed revolution without any plan or capacity to support it militarily. Operation Wappen would be executed in 1957, and this was a CIA-backed coup attempt in Syria, orchestrated during the height of the Cold War under leadership of Kermit Roosevelt Jr., who had previously seen the successful coup in Iran, or Operation Ajax. The US government grew concerned of Syria's growing ties with the Soviet Union, and the Eisenhower administration feared that Syria would soon become a Soviet satellite in the heart of the Middle East, threatening both American strategic interests and allies such as Turkey, Jordan, and Iraq. Under Operation Wappen, the CIA funneled an estimated $3 million in bribes to a group of Syrian military officers with the goal of triggering a regime change that would align Syria with Western interests. However, the operation would unravel when several of the bribed officers turned themselves into Syrian intelligence, exposing the entire plot, and the officers would even hand over the cash and identify their CIA contacts. And as a result, CIA agents Robert Molay, Francis Jayton, and Howard E. Rocky Stone would be arrested and subsequently expelled from the country. And the US State Department would of course deny any involvement, claiming Syrian accusations were fabricated. US credibility in the region would take a major hit, and anti-American sentiment would surge in Syria and the Arab world. Yeah, this was a really bad, botched regime change that not only failed to achieve its goals, but pushed Syria further into the Soviet sphere. Between 1957 and 1958, the CIA would engage in a covert effort to destabilize the government of President Sukarno in Indonesia as part of their broader Cold War strategy to undermine leaders perceived as insufficiently anti-communist. Although Sukarno was not a communist himself, his non-aligned foreign policy and growing ties with the Indonesian Communist Party and resistance to Western economic influence raised alarm in Washington. In response, the Eisenhower administration, working through the CIA, began secretly supporting a series of regional military rebellions in Indonesia's outer provinces, particularly Sumatra and Sulawesi. The CIA supplied these rebel factions with arms, ammunition, funds, and intelligence. It even helped them set up a clandestine rebel radio station, which would broadcast anti-Sukarno propaganda under the guise of an internal resistance movement. The operation escalated in early 1958 when CIA pilots, American citizens on agency payroll, began flying bombing missions in support of the rebels. These missions targeted Indonesian military installations and supply lines, and in some cases resulted in civilian casualties. The covert nature of U.S. involvement unraveled when one of these pilots, Alan Lawrence Pope, was shot down May 18, 1958, while attacking a government-held target in Ambon. Pope would be captured alive, and documents found on him directly linked him to the CIA, and this incident exposed the operation to the international community, sparking a major diplomatic embarrassment for the United States. However, the Eisenhower administration quickly denied official involvement. Faced with the scandal, the U.S. abandoned direct support for the rebellion, and Sukarno's forces would swiftly crush the insurgents by mid-1958. Following Fidel Castro's rise to power in 1959 after the Cuban Revolution, the CIA and U.S. government rapidly classified his regime as a significant threat to American interests in the Western Hemisphere. Initially hailed by some in the U.S. as a potential reformer, Castro's nationalization of American-owned industries, alignment with the Soviet Union, and outspoken anti-Americanism swiftly ended any hopes for diplomatic cooperation. By 1960, President Dwight D. Eisenhower authorized the CIA to begin covert action to undermine and eventually remove Castro from power, initiating a series of plots that would later fall under the umbrella of Operation Mongoose. The CIA's efforts included sabotage campaigns, psychological warfare, and most notoriously, repeated attempts to assassinate Castro. The CIA recruited mafia figures to carry out these assassination attempts, and the idea was that organized crime, already angry at Castro for shutting down their casinos in Havana, had the networks and moral flexibility to do the job covertly. The CIA-mafia collaboration would lead to a series of bizarre and desperate assassination plots, and confirmed methods included poison pills, missiles, a toxic wetsuit, and even an exploding cigar. Though these plots sound far-fetched, many of them were confirmed in declassified files or Senate hearings in the 1970s, and none of them succeeded, and Castro even mocked the efforts publicly. And these attempts would lay the groundwork for the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, and more broadly, this revealed how Cold War paranoia and regime change obsession would lead the US government to partner with criminals, violate international law, and risk massive geopolitical blowback in pursuit of eliminating one single ideological adversary. In 1959, the CIA would begin deep involvement in Laos as a part of a covert effort to contain the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. This marked the beginning of what would become one of the agency's most extensive and long-running secret wars, often referred to as the Secret War in Laos. As Laos descended into civil conflict between the Royal Lao government and the communist Pathet Lao, the CIA saw the country as a critical Cold War battleground. Under the leadership of CIA operative Bill Lair and later Ted Shackley, the agency began recruiting and arming the Hmong ethnic minority, led by General Vang Pao, to form a guerrilla army and fight against the Pathet Lao and their North Vietnamese allies. The Hmong, who lived in remote highlands, were seen as ideal irregular forces due to their knowledge of the terrain and their fierce opposition to communism. And by the 1960s, the CIA had fully established a paramilitary infrastructure in Laos, constructing airstrips, supplying arms and food, and providing air support through Air America, which we talked about, the CIA front airline. This was done under the radar as the US was bound by international treaties that declared Laos neutral, and an especially controversial aspect of the CIA's Laotian campaign was its intersection with the opium trade. The highlands of Laos, northern Thailand, and Burma form the Golden Triangle, one of the world's largest opium-producing regions. Many of the Hmong fighters under General Vang Pao were also traditional opium cultivators, and as the CIA operations ramped up, allegations emerged that Air America aircraft were being used to transport opium, either directly or by turning a blind eye to local trafficking, as long as anti-communist operations were prioritized. Though the CIA has consistently denied any institutional involvement in the drug trade, various investigations, including those by journalist Alfred McCoy, have documented the close proximity between CIA logistics and opium trafficking networks. The war in Laos would escalate dramatically during the 1960s and early 1970s, with the US bombing campaigns making Laos the most heavily bombed country per capita in history. And by the time the US withdrew in 1975, the communist Pathet Lao had taken over, and thousands of Hmong fighters were left vulnerable to reprisals, and many fled or resettled in the United States. And this covert war would leave a very complex legacy, as while it delayed communist control for over a decade, it also resulted in mass displacement, widespread civilian casualties, and lingering accusations of complicity in the global drug trade, all under a veil of secrecy that wouldn't be lifted until around the 1970s. The U-2 spy plane incident of May 1st, 1960 was one of the most high-profile intelligence failures of the Cold War and diplomatic disaster for the United States. The incident centered around Francis Gary Powers, a CIA pilot flying a Lockheed U-2 under the Project Aquatone program, jointly run by the CIA and US Air Force. The U-2 had been conducting surveillance missions over Soviet territory since 1956, flying at altitudes around 70,000 feet, which were initially believed to be beyond reach of Soviet air defenses. These missions collected invaluable intelligence on Soviet missile sites, nuclear facilities, and military infrastructure, and on May 1st, 1960, Powers took off from a US base in Pakistan, intending to fly across the USSR and land in Norway. However, the Soviets had improved their radar tracking and missile systems, and Powers' aircraft would be detected, targeted, and shot down. Powers survived the crash and was captured alive, and the US initially claimed that Powers was a NASA weather reconnaissance pilot who had gone off course. But the story would unravel when it was revealed that Powers had confessed and the wreckage had been recovered. The incident triggered an international scandal that severely damaged US-Soviet relations, and most notably, it derailed a critical peace summit scheduled in Paris just weeks later between President Dwight D. Eisenhower and Khrushchev, effectively ending any immediate hope for nuclear arms control talks or detente. And Powers would be convicted of espionage in a Soviet show trial, but would eventually be released in 1962 in a spy swap for a captured Soviet agent, Rudolf Abel. The Congo crisis from 1960 to 1965 was one of the most earliest and most explosive post-colonial Cold War conflicts, and it drew the CIA into a murky and deadly web of foreign intrigue, resource politics, and ideological paranoia. In June 1960, the Republic of the Congo, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, would gain independence from Belgium, with Patrice Lumumba as its first democratically elected prime minister. Lumumba, a nationalist and left-leaning figure, quickly alarmed Western powers with his rhetoric about anti-imperialism and non-alignment, especially after appealing to the Soviet Union for assistance during internal unrest and mutiny in the newly independent army. To CIA Director Allen Dulles, Lumumba was seen as, quote, Africa's Castro, a potential Soviet proxy in a resource-rich, geopolitical vital region. And on August 26, 1960, Dulles sent a secret cable to CIA Station Chief Larry Devlin in Leopoldville, instructing him to pursue the removal of Lumumba from power by any means necessary. Shortly thereafter, the CIA devised a plan to assassinate Lumumba, and though the plot was ultimately aborted due to logistical problems and shifting political dynamics, it revealed the depth of CIA involvement in foreign regime change operations, even in post-colonial Africa. Lumumba would not be assassinated by the CIA directly, but he would be captured, beaten, and executed by forces loyal to Congolese rivals, particularly Moise Tshombe and Joseph Mobutu, both of whom had received support from Western powers, including the US and Belgium. On January 17, 1961, Lumumba would be executed by firing squad in Katanga. And while the CIA's poison plot was never implemented, numerous investigations, including the 1975 Church Committee hearings, confirmed that the CIA had aggressively pursued Lumumba's removal and worked to support those who ultimately orchestrated his death. CIA Station Chief Larry Devlin later admitted to channeling US funds to Lumumba's political enemies and obstructing potential rescue efforts, and Belgium, too, later admitted responsibility for direct involvement in Lumumba's death, and in 2002 they even issued a formal apology. The question to whoever gave the final kill order remains disputed, but the cumulative evidence demonstrates that Lumumba's assassination was the result of coordinated efforts between Western intelligence, Belgian colonial holdovers, and Congolese elites, all aligned against a leader who dared to chart an independent path for his country. The fallout from Lumumba's murder was immense, as it completely destabilized the Congo for decades, and it solidified Mobutu Sese Seko's US-backed dictatorship and left a deep scar on African political memory, symbolizing Western willingness to subvert democracy, all in the name of anti-communism. The Bay of Pigs invasion, launched in April 1961, was a failed US-backed operation intended to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government in Cuba. Planned under President Dwight D. Eisenhower and inherited by John F. Kennedy, the CIA orchestrated the mission by recruiting and training approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles, mostly anti-Castro refugees, at secret camps in Guatemala and Nicaragua. These exiles, organized as Brigade 2506, were promised air support and US military backing once they landed. The invasion force came ashore at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southern coast on April 17, 1961, expecting to spark a popular uprising that would topple Castro. Instead, they encountered a well-prepared Cuban military force and widespread popular support for Castro's regime. The CIA had dramatically underestimated both Castro's intelligence network and the resilience of his government. And even worse, President Kennedy, wary of provoking the Soviet Union and escalating tensions during the Cold War, refused to authorize full US air cover, and the result of this invasion was a complete disaster, as within 72 hours, most of the exiles were killed or captured, and the operation became a humiliating public failure for both the CIA and the new Kennedy administration. The Cuban government would parade captured invaders before the world press, and the US was exposed as the architect of the illegal invasion. This botched operation would severely damage America's credibility in Latin America and boosted Castro's popularity at home, solidifying his alignment with the Soviet Union. The political fallout was immense, as Kennedy privately blamed the CIA and threatened to splinter the agency into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. The debacle also led to internal reviews and the resignation of CIA Director Allen Dulles, and a major reevaluation of US covert action strategy. On May 30th, 1961, Rafael Trujillo, a dictator of the Dominican Republic since 1930, would be assassinated in an ambush by local dissidents, a plot in which the CIA played a confirmed supporting role. Though the assassination itself was carried out by Dominicans, declassified CIA documents and internal investigations have confirmed that the United States government provided material support for the operation. Now, by late 1960, the Eisenhower administration had grown increasingly concerned with Trujillo's erratic behavior, especially his attempted assassination of Venezuelan President President Romulo Betancourt and his growing hostility towards U.S. influence in the region. The CIA decided that Trujillo's removal was in U.S. interests, and CIA officers operating from the U.S. consulate in the Dominican Republic began meeting with anti-Trujillo conspirators, providing them with logistical support, intelligence, and most significantly, arms shipments hidden in crates labeled as food and supplies. However, the CIA support would become politically complicated following the Bay of Pigs fiasco in April 1961 that year, which made the Kennedy administration wary of being linked to yet another covert operation. According to declassified CIA records, Washington attempted to halt the operation shortly before the assassination, fearing blowback and instability in the region. However, by that point, the weapons and intelligence had already been delivered, and the conspirators went forward with the plan. As on the night of May 30th, Trujillo's vehicle would be ambushed on a remote highway outside Santo Domingo, and he would be shot multiple times by a group of Dominicans. In the aftermath, the CIA tried to distance itself from direct involvement, but internal reports in a 1973 CIA Inspector General summary acknowledged the agency's material and tactical role in enabling the assassination. And while the operation succeeded in eliminating one of the Western Hemisphere's longest-standing dictators, it did not lead to any immediate stability, as the Dominican Republic descended into political chaos, including a civil war and eventually another U.S. military intervention in 1965. Operation Northwoods was a top-secret U.S. Department of Defense proposal developed in 1962 by the Joint Chiefs of Staff under leadership of Chairman General Lyman Lemnitzer during the height of the Cold War tensions with Fidel Castro's Cuba. The plan, drafted by the Pentagon's Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, called for a series of false flag operations, that is, attacks that would appear to be carried out by a foreign enemy but were actually staged or orchestrated by the U.S. itself. The goal was to create a pretext for a full-scale military invasion of Cuba by manipulating public opinion and galvanizing political will through fabricated acts of Cuban aggression. Proposed tactics included hijacking or shooting down U.S. commercial airliners, sinking refugee boats, bombing U.S. cities, staging mock funerals, and even launching attacks on Guantanamo Bay, all to be falsely attributed to Castro's regime. The authors believed that these actions would incite outrage at home and abroad, legitimizing U.S. intervention in Cuba just months after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. President John F. Kennedy would reject the proposal outright, as he was reportedly disturbed by the extremity of the suggestions, and shortly thereafter, General Lemnitzer would be removed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And while Operation Northwoods was never implemented, the full plan would be declassified in 1997 through a Freedom of Information Act request, and its revelations would stun the public and provided concrete evidence that senior U.S. military officials had seriously contemplated staging terrorist attacks against American citizens to engineer consent for war. And though technically a conspiracy that never left the planning stage, Northwoods remains one of the most damning examples of extremism within the national security establishment, and has since become a cornerstone reference in discussions about government overreach, psychological operations, and the ethics of pretextual warfare. Donald Rickard was a U.S. diplomat and confirmed CIA operative whose covert role became historically significant for his alleged involvement in the arrest of Nelson Mandela in 1962. Though Rickard officially served as a U.S. vice consul in Durban, South Africa, he simultaneously worked as an undercover CIA officer during the height of apartheid and the global Cold War. At the time, the CIA and U.S. government viewed African liberation movements, especially those with socialist leanings, as potential entry points for Soviet influence. And Mandela, a key figure in the African National Congress, had recently returned from a secret international tour to garner support and training for the anti-apartheid struggle, and according to a 2016 interview with Rickard just before his death, he admitted that he had provided the tip that led to Mandela's arrest on August 5th, 1962. Rickard claimed that Mandela was, quote, one of the most dangerous communists outside of the Soviet Union, and that the CIA acted to prevent what they believed would be a Soviet-aligned revolution in South Africa. Mandela would, of course, be arrested and subsequently was imprisoned for 27 years, and the CIA's alleged role in his capture has long been suspected by historians and journalists, but Rickard's deathbed confession provides one of the most direct confirmations to date. Still, the CIA does not acknowledge complicity in Mandela's detention. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas remains one of the most scrutinized events in American history and the epicenter of widespread conspiracy theories. Officially, JFK was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, who fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, and Oswald would be arrested the same day but murdered 2 days later by nightclub owner Jack Ruby before he could stand trial. Now, the Warren Commission will be formed in 1964 under Chief Justice Orel Warren and concluded that Oswald had acted alone and found no evidence of wider conspiracy. However, the single bullet theory, forensic inconsistencies, eyewitness contradictions, and the suspicious timing of Oswald's death immediately fueled doubt, and many conspiracy theories link the CIA to Kennedy's assassination, citing a series of personal and institutional conflicts, as JFK had privately blamed the agency for the Bay of Pigs invasion and subsequently fired CIA Director Alan Dulles, Deputy Director Charles Cable, and others, and people argued that this created resentment within the agency, especially among hardline Cold Warriors and anti-Castro factions. Alan Dulles himself would controversially be appointed to the Warren Commission, which is just crazy, to be honest. I don't like, you would think there's a conflict of interest there. Anyways, further suspicion would center on CIA officer E. Howard Hunt, who was alleged to have made veiled admissions of CIA involvement in late-life statements. And additionally, declassified records have revealed that the CIA withheld key documents from the Warren Commission, including information about Oswald's prior interactions with CIA-linked anti-Castro Cubans and his mysterious 1963 trip to Mexico City, where he visited the Soviet and Cuban embassies. The 1979 Select Committee on Assassinations would conclude that JFK was, quote, probably assassinated as a result of conspiracy, but did not find any definitive CIA involvement. And to this day, the truth, full truth, remains elusive. The 1963 coup that led to the assassination of President Ngo Dinh Diem was a pivotal movement in the escalation of U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, and one in which the CIA and U.S. government played a direct role. By the early 1960s, Diem, a Catholic nationalist backed by the U.S. since the 1950s, had become increasingly authoritarian and unpopular, especially among the Buddhist majority. His regime's brutal repression of Buddhist protests in 1963, including the infamous self-immolation of a monk, sparked outrage both within Vietnam and internationally. American public support for Diem would begin to erode, and U.S. officials debated whether he was still a viable ally in their fight against communist insurgency. In August of 1963, a cable would be sent from Washington to U.S. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., signaling that the U.S. would not oppose a coup if one emerged from the South Vietnamese military. The CIA, of course, had already developed close ties with the Army of the Republic of Vietnam generals and had intelligence suggesting that a plot was underway, and though the U.S. never explicitly ordered Diem's removal, the agency gave quiet approval and refrained from warning him, effectively greenlighting the coup. On November 1st, 1963, South Vietnamese generals would launch the coup. Diem and his brother would flee the presidential palace but were captured the following day, and despite promises of safe passage, both men were executed in the back of an armored personnel carrier, likely on orders from General Duong Van Minh, one of the coup's leaders. The Kennedy administration, though officially expressing shock, was fully aware of the CIA's involvement and its role in enabling the overthrow. And while U.S. officials hoped the new military junta would stabilize South Vietnam and strengthen anti-communist efforts, the coup instead deepened political chaos, triggering a revolving door of unstable regimes, and this instability led the U.S. to dramatically escalate its military involvement, culminating in the deployment of combat troops in 1965. In 1964, the United States, through the CIA and other branches of U.S. government, would play a critical role in supporting a military coup that overthrew Brazilian President João Goulart. Goulart, a left-leaning nationalist, had implemented land reforms, supported labor unions, and sought to nationalize key industries, including oil and banking, which alarmed the U.S. government and feared that he was steering Brazil towards communism. The Kennedy administration had already begun covert planning to undermine Goulart, but after Kennedy's death in 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson would escalate the operation. U.S. Ambassador to Brazil Lincoln Gordon, along with CIA Station Chief John M. Chambers, would work closely with Brazilian military leaders, encouraging them to seize power and providing intelligence, communications equipment, and assurances of U.S. backing. When the coup was launched on March 31st, 1964, the U.S. had prepared Operation Brother Sam, which mobilized a naval task force loaded with fuel and ammunition off Brazil's coast, ready to assist the coup if needed. Though direct intervention proved unnecessary, as Goulart fled the country without military resistance. The U.S.-supported coup would usher in a military dictatorship that would rule Brazil for the next 21 years, marked by political repression, censorship, and systematic human rights abuses. The new regime immediately suspended democratic institutions, arrested political opponents, and outlawed leftist parties, and torture, disappearances, and extrajudicial killings will become common tools of state control, especially during the dictatorship's most brutal period during the late 1960s and 1970s. Declassified U.S. government documents later confirmed that the CIA and State Department were aware of and supported the use of torture by Brazilian security forces, rationalizing it as necessary to combat communist subversion, and Washington would continue to provide military aid, training, and diplomatic support to the regime for years, even as reports of repression mounted. The long-term consequences of this would include deep social scars, economic instability, and a legacy of distrust towards U.S. involvement in Latin American politics that persists to this day. The 1965 Indonesian mass killings represent one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century and one of the most controversial alleged episodes of U.S. covert involvement. Now, following a failed coup on September 30th, 1965, which was blamed on the Indonesian Communist Party, General Suharto would seize power and launched a sweeping anti-communist purge. Over the next several months, the Indonesian military and allied paramilitaries would massacre an estimated 500,000 to 1 million people, targeting not only Indonesian Communist Party members, but suspected leftists, trade unionists, intellectuals, ethnic Chinese, and rural villagers. The violence was systemic and well coordinated across Java, Bali, and Sumatra. And although the U.S. government publicly expressed concern about the violence, declassified diplomatic cables, eyewitness testimonies, and internal communications suggest that American officials privately welcomed the purge as a Cold War victory. At the time, the U.S. feared that Indonesia might fall into Soviet or Chinese sphere of influence under President Sukarno, who had allowed the Indonesian Communist Party to become one of the world's largest non-ruling communist parties. And this purge would effectively dismantle the Indonesian Communist Party, ending Indonesia's experiment with left-leaning nationalism and paving the way for Suharto's 3-decade military dictatorship. One of the most persistent and disturbing allegations is that the CIA and U.S. Embassy provided Indonesian forces with, quote, kill lists, names of thousands of alleged Indonesian Communist Party members and sympathizers to be arrested and or executed. In interviews decades later, Robert Martins, a former U.S. political officer in Jakarta, admitted that the embassy had compiled lists of some 5,000 individuals, which were quietly handed over to the Indonesian army. And Martins said that the names came from open sources in embassy intelligence, and that U.S. officials would follow up with field officers to track who had been arrested or killed, reportedly checking off names as the purge progressed. Other embassy officials corroborated this, and declassified State Department cables from 1965 to 1966 show U.S. diplomats expressing approval of Suharto's actions. However, official U.S. agencies, including the CIA, have never confirmed the existence of a formal death list or direct role in the killings. In 1967, the CIA played a central but largely covert role in the capture and execution of Che Guevara, a Marxist revolutionary and former lieutenant of Fidel Castro. After his success in the Cuban Revolution, Guevara attempted to ignite similar uprisings in the Congo and later Bolivia, where he hoped to spark a pan-Latin American insurgency against US-backed regimes. By 1967, Guevara and a small guerrilla force had entered Bolivia's remote Nyankahazoo region, but they faced logistical failures, poor communication, and a lack of local support. As soon as his presence was detected, the CIA, U.S. Army Special Forces, and the Bolivian government launched a coordinated effort to track and eliminate him. The CIA dispatched operatives to Bolivia, including Felix Rodriguez, who was a Cuban exile and seasoned CIA asset who had worked on previous anti-Castro operations. Rodriguez helped train and advise the Bolivian Ranger Battalion, a special forces unit created with U.S. support specifically for counterinsurgency missions. The unit received direct training from U.S. military advisors at a base in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, and on on October 8th, 1967, Guevara would be wounded and captured alive in a firefight with Bolivian troops. He was taken to a small schoolhouse in the village of La Higuera, where he was held overnight, and CIA operatives, including Rodriguez, interrogated him during this time. Although the CIA reportedly wanted him kept alive for further intelligence, the Bolivian government opted to execute him the next day, and on October 9th, Guevara would be executed by Bolivian Sergeant Mario Terán. The CIA was not only present on site during the capture and execution, but also helped oversee the aftermath, including the photographic documentation of his body. His hands were severed for fingerprint confirmation, and his body was secretly buried in an unmarked grave that wasn't discovered until 1997, and the US would see the operation as a strategic victory against international communism. The Phoenix program, launched in 1968, was a covert CIA-led initiative during the Vietnam War aimed at dismantling the Viet Cong infrastructure, which was the network of communist operatives, informants, and sympathizers embedded within South Vietnam. Officially run by the CIA in cooperation with U.S. military intelligence, South Vietnamese forces, and special police, the Phoenix program sought to neutralize the Viet Cong infrastructure through a mix of intelligence gathering, infiltration, interrogation, detention, and assassination. It was structured to coordinate U.S. and South Vietnamese efforts to identify and remove the Viet Cong's covert civilian support systems in rural areas, which was something the regular military was not equipped to do. Using informant networks, captured documents, and surveillance, suspects would be placed on blacklists or targeted for capture or death. Interrogation centers, known as provincial interrogation centers, would be established throughout the country, often operated with CIA funding and oversight, and by 1972, over 80,000 individuals had been, quote, neutralized, with at least 26,000 reported killed, though exact numbers vary and remain heavily disputed. While the U.S. government portrayed Phoenix as a necessary counterinsurgency tool, the program will become infamous for human rights abuses, lack of oversight, and systemic use of torture and extrajudicial killings. Suspects were frequently arrested without due process, and many were targeted based on faulty intelligence, personal vendettas, or coerced confessions. Torture methods included beating, electric shocks, and waterboarding, and whistleblowers like former military intelligence officer K. Barton Osborne would testify before Congress in 1971, describing the program as rife with abuse and comparing its interrogation centers to concentration camps. Despite these revelations, the CIA defended Phoenix as a legitimate and effective tool of irregular warfare. However, of course, the program would significantly damage U.S. credibility both domestically and internationally, and further alienated the South Vietnamese population, many of whom saw it as a campaign of terror. And eventually, the Phoenix program would be gradually phased out by 1972. Project MK Often, allegedly launched during the 1960s and peaking around 1969, was one of the several reported offshoots of the CIA's broader MK-Ultra program. And while official documentation of MK Often remains sparse, various sources, including investigative journalist Gordon Thomas and declassified fragments, claim that the project was a joint venture between the CIA and U.S. Army's Chemical Corps at Edgewood Arsenal, and MK Often is said to have focused on behavioral research, including hallucinogens and other drugs, and these experiments reportedly tested whether supernatural or altered states of consciousness could enhance interrogation, influence behavior, or be used in psychological warfare. And while MK Often's exact scope and methodology are still debated, largely due to the CIA's destruction of MK-Ultra records in 1973, claims about the program often veer into the bizarre, as some researchers allege that CIA personnel attended seances, studied voodoo rituals, and experimented with demonic invocations or summoning entities, though these claims remain largely unverified and are viewed by many historians as exaggerated or folklore. Project Resistance and Operation Chaos were covert surveillance programs run by the CIA beginning in the late 1960s and intensifying around 1970, aimed at monitoring and infiltrating domestic dissident movements in the United States, particularly student activists, civil rights groups, and anti-Vietnam War organizations. Both projects operated in clear violation of the CIA's founding charter, which explicitly barred it from engaging in domestic law enforcement or surveillance activities. Now, Project Resistance focused on collecting intelligence on domestic groups that might pose a quote threat to federal facilities or operations, particularly those seen as harboring anti-government sentiment, and the CIA coordinated with local police departments, college administrations, and other federal agencies to compile dossiers on thousands of activists, student leaders, and professors, often based on little more than dissenting opinions or protest activity. CIA officers would pose as students or journalists to infiltrate protests and meetings, feeding reports back to the organization. And Operation Chaos would be established under CIA Director Richard Helms at the request of Lyndon B. Johnson and later President Richard Nixon, who feared that the anti-war movements were becoming influenced or funded by foreign adversaries, particularly the Soviet Union and Cuba. Chaos would be tasked with uncovering such links, but its mission quickly expanded into a broad domestic spying campaign with no solid evidence of foreign control. The CIA compiled files on over 7,000 citizens and monitored more than 1,000 groups, and coordinated with FBI's COINTELPRO, NSA's Project Minaret, and the Army's domestic surveillance units, forming a sprawling, illegal intelligence dragnet. These programs will be exposed during the 1975 Church Committee hearings, which concluded that the CIA had grossly overstepped its legal authority and violated constitutional protections, and both resistance and chaos had been officially terminated in the mid-1970s, but their existence highlighted the extent to which the U.S. intelligence community turned inward, spying on its own citizens under the guise of national security. In 1970, following the democratic election of Salvador Allende, a Marxist candidate representing the Popular Unity Coalition as president of Chile, the CIA launched a covert operation codenamed Project Fubelt, also known as Track 2, to prevent him from taking office. The campaign was ordered directly by President Richard Nixon, who, along with National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, viewed Allende's presidency as a serious threat to U.S. economic and geopolitical interests in Latin America. The classified documents revealed that Nixon explicitly told CIA Director Richard Helms to, quote, make the economy scream, and authorized $10 million or more in covert funding to destabilize Chile. The CIA strategy included bribing Chilean congressmen, funding strikes at anti-Allende media outlets, and most significantly, encouraging Chilean military officers to try and carry out a coup before Allende could be inaugurated. This operation was kept secret from the U.S. State Department and was distinct from Track 1, which involved political and economic pressure through official diplomatic channels. One of the most explosive outcomes of Track 2 was the attempted kidnapping of General Rene Schneider, Chile's constitutional loyal army commander-in-chief who opposed military intervention against Allende. Schneider's commitment to constitutionalism was a direct obstacle in the CIA's goal of pre-inauguration coup, and in October 1970, CIA contacts in Chile facilitated a plot to abduct Schneider and remove him from the equation. The agency provided money, communications, gear, and untraceable weapons to Chilean conspirators, and on October 22, 1970, the operation went fatally wrong. Schneider was shot during a failed kidnapping attempt and died 3 days later. The CIA claimed it never intended Schneider to be killed, but declassified files show the agency was fully aware of the plot and had even armed the perpetrators. Despite the chaos, Allende would assume office in November 1970, and the CIA would continue their operations under the now public Track 1, pouring millions into opposition parties, right-wing newspapers, business federations, and student groups to undermine Allende's government for the next 3 years. And these destabilization efforts would continue throughout his presidency. In 1971, the groundwork for what would become known as Echelon, or a highly classified global signals intelligence surveillance system, would be laid, with the CIA playing a central role along the NSA, GCHQ from the UK, and other members of the Five Eyes intelligence alliance, that being the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. While the program was primarily administered by the NSA, the CIA contributed to its overseas infrastructure, operational cover, and foreign intelligence coordination, especially in areas where overt U.S. military presence would have drawn attention. Echelon was designed to intercept virtually all forms of electronic communication, phone calls, faxes, emails, and satellite transmissions across borders, with the capacity to filter for specific keywords and flags. What began as a Cold War-era system to monitor Soviet and Warsaw Pact communications expanded into a global dragnet of spying on foreign governments, corporations, journalists, and private citizens. CIA assets abroad often assisted in the construction and security of Echelon ground stations, particularly in politically sensitive regions like the UK's Menwith Hill base or Australia's Pine Gap facility. Although officially denied for decades, Echelon's existence would be confirmed through a combination of investigative journalism, whistleblower accounts, including that of NSA analyst, Margaret Newsom, and European parliamentary inquiries in the 90s and early 2000s. The CIA's involvement in Echelon primarily revolved around exploiting the intelligence for covert action planning, political leverage, and controversially economic espionage, as they reportedly shared intercepted corporate secrets with U.S. industries. And though Echelon was not solely a CIA program, the agency's integration into its output pipelines and global footprint made it a key participant in one of the most expansive and intrusive surveillance operations of the 20th century. The Watergate Scandal, which began with the June 17, 1972 arrest of 5 men inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex, quickly unraveled into a broader political crisis with indirect but significant ties to the CIA. Now, of the 5 burglars, 4 had past connections to the CIA, most notably E. Howard Hunt and James McCord. Hunt was a long-serving CIA officer who worked on numerous covert operations, including the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, and at the time of the break-in, Hunt was employed by the Nixon White House as a part of the so-called, quote, plumbers unit, tasked with preventing information leaks. James McCord, a former CIA security officer, was also linked to the Republican National Committee, and initially the CIA was not involved in the planning or the execution of this break-in, but the Nixon administration officials quickly attempted to drag the agency into the cover-up. In the days following the arrest, top White House aides H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman pressured the CIA to intervene with the FBI, instructing the agency to falsely claim that the Watergate investigation was touching on, quote, national security matters and should be halted. However, CIA Director Richard Helms and Deputy Director Vernon Walters resisted this pressure, recognizing the legal and ethical dangers of misusing the agency for political ends. Ironically, and while Helms and Walters made initial efforts to comply with limited White House requests, they ultimately refused to fully obstruct the FBI's investigation, and instead they quietly documented the White House's course of efforts, protecting the agency from deeper entanglement. Nonetheless, the CIA's peripheral role would raise serious questions, as it was later confirmed that CIA officers had previously issued alias documents to E. Howard Hunt, and that Nixon's teams had sought CIA hush money to pay off the arrested burglars. And in 1973 hearings, Helms testified firmly that, quote, the CIA had nothing to do with the Watergate break-in. A statement that was technically accurate regarding operation involvement, but did not address the agency's pre-existing relationships with the individuals that were actually involved. Ultimately, this scandal did not implicate the CIA in any criminal conspiracy, but it's also served as a cautionary episode given what we already know about the agency. In 1973, the CIA played a central role in destabilizing the democratically elected government of President Salvador Allende in Chile. This all culminated in a military coup that brought General Augusto Pinochet to power. Now, Allende, a Marxist and the leader of the Popular Unity Coalition, had been elected in 1970, and his presidency alarmed the Nixon administration, which feared that Chile was becoming a model for socialist success in the Western Hemisphere. Like we discussed, the CIA spent millions of dollars between 1970 and 1973 to support opposition media, fund anti-Allende political armies, influence labor unions, and stoke public unrest. This campaign included efforts to disrupt Chile's economy through strikes, sabotage, and the withdrawal of international financial support. While the CIA did not directly carry out the September 11, 1973 coup, it created the conditions and alliances, especially within Chile's military and business elite, that helped pave the way for it. Following the coup, which resulted in President Allende's death and the bombing of the presidential palace, the U.S. government quickly recognized and supported Pinochet's military junta, despite its brutal repression. Pinochet's regime would go on to detain, torture, or forcibly disappear thousands of Chileans, many of whom were left-wing activists, students, or union leaders. And the CIA would maintain close ties with Chilean intelligence services, particularly DINA, which carried out internal repression and assassinated political opponents abroad, all under the justification of anti-communism. In 1974, we'd see the Family Jewels expose published by investigative journalist Seymour Hersh on December 22, 1974 in the New York Times. And this marked a historic turning point in the public awareness of U.S. intelligence overreach. Hersh revealed that the CIA had engaged in a wide array of illegal domestic operations, despite its legal mandate to act solely abroad. This included Operation Chaos, in which the CIA spied on anti-war activists, civil rights leaders, and other American dissidents during the Vietnam War era, And Hirsch's whole report drew from a leaked internal CIA dossier known as the Family Jewels, a 693-page compilation of the agency's most sensitive and damning activities compiled in 1973. The file contained revelations of assassination plots against foreign leaders such as Fidel Castro, Patrice Lumumba, Rafael Trujillo, Ngo Dinh Diem, as well as details of MK-Ultra. And in response to this scandal, Congress launched the first major investigations into the intelligence community in U.S. history. In 1975, the Senate formed the Church Committee, chaired by Senator Frank Church, while the House created the Pike Committee, chaired by Representative Otis Pike. And these bipartisan investigations confirmed patterns of abuses within the CIA, FBI, NSA, and IRS, revealing how executive agencies had repeatedly violated the Constitution, operated without oversight, and targeted political opponents and dissidents. The Church Committee's final reports, published from 1975 to 1976, exposed CIA involvement in covert regime change operations in Chile, Guatemala, and Iran, extensive domestic surveillance and illegal activities by FBI's COINTELPRO, NSA wiretapping, and IRS political targeting. This fallout led to sweeping reforms, as President Gerald Ford issued Executive Order 11905, which banned U.S.-sponsored political assassinations, and Congress established permanent intelligence oversight committees. One of the most shocking revelations was the display of a CIA-developed assassination device, a battery-powered poison dart gun. According to CIA testimony, it could penetrate clothing, deliver a fatal dose in seconds, and then melt away inside the bombing, virtually leaving no trace, and the toxin would induce cardiac arrest, mimicking a natural heart attack and making it nearly impossible for forensic pathologists to detect foul play. This was just one of many things that they found. If you ever have time, just go through the Family Jewels report. It's interesting. In 1975, we'd see Operation Condor be officially launched, and this was a secretive US-backed transnational intelligence alliance between right-wing military dictatorships in South America, primarily Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, and Bolivia, to coordinate the suppression, surveillance, kidnapping, torture, and assassination of political dissidents, especially leftist activists and exiled opponents. The operation was formalized at a clandestine meeting in Santiago, Chile, and facilitated by regional intelligence services, including Chile's DINA, Argentina's SIDE, and Uruguay's SID. While the operation was led by Latin American regimes, declassified U.S. documents and testimonies confirmed that the CIA and other U.S. agencies provided crucial support, including intelligence sharing, communication systems, and training. Operation Condor was born in the broader context of the Cold War, when Washington, through its anti-communist doctrine, increasingly supported authoritarian governments as long as they aligned against Soviet Union and leftist movements. Under the guise of national security, Condor allowed participating regimes to cross borders and eliminate exiled opponents who had fled to neighboring countries, making repression a region-wide, collaborative campaign. The CIA, under directors like William Colby and later George H.W. Bush, were aware of the operation's nature and scale, and although the agency has long denied direct involvement in assassinations, declassified State Department cables, such as those revealed by U.S. Ambassador Robert White, demonstrate that U.S. intelligence not only had detailed knowledge of Operation Condor's mechanics, but also facilitated its communications infrastructure, most notably through a U.S.-supplied telecommunications hub based in Panama. Victims of Operation Condor included former government officials, students, priests, labor organizers, and journalists, and many of whom were kidnapped, tortured, or disappeared. And human rights groups estimate that at least 60,000 people were killed or disappeared under Operation Condor. And while the program officially faded in the early 1980s, its legacy endured through decades of impunity and silence, until trials and investigations into the 2000s began to hold some perpetrators accountable. In 1975, we'd see the Rockefeller Commission be established, officially known as the United States President's Commission on CIA Activities within the United States, and this was created by President Gerald Ford in response to growing public and political outrage over revelations of domestic spying and covert abuses by U.S. intelligence. And the investigation focused on CIA projects like Operation Chaos and also examined Project MK-Ultra, and the Rockefeller Commission confirmed numerous violations of U.S. laws and civil liberties by the CIA, including the opening of private mail, warrantless wiretapping, surveillance of journalists and political activists and involvement in assassination plots abroad. The CIA had maintained files on over 700,000 American citizens, despite its charter explicitly forbidding domestic intelligence collection. It also uncovered that the agency had funded academic research and manipulated student groups to serve its interests during the Cold War, and the Rockefeller Commission was one of the first official acknowledgments that the CIA significantly overstepped its bounds, as this would lead to more congressional investigations that we already talked about, like the Church Committee and Pike Committee. In 1975, the CIA would launch a covert Angola operation to influence the outcome of the country's post-independence civil war, marking one of the most significant U.S. interventions in post-colonial Africa during the Cold War. Now, after Portugal withdrew from its former colony, three main factions would vie for control: the Soviet and Cuban-backed MPLA, or Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, the U.S. and South African-backed UNITA, or National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, and the FNLA, or National Liberation Front of Angola, which received early CIA support. Viewing Angola as a critical Cold War battleground, the CIA, under the direction of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and with support from President Gerald Ford, began secretly arming and funding UNITA and FNLA forces in an effort to prevent a communist-aligned government from taking power. Operation IA Feature, as it was internally called, provided over $30 million in covert assistance to anti-MPLA fighters, including weapons, logistical support, and coordination with South African Defense Forces, who invaded Angola from the south. However, the operation quickly became controversial as it lacked congressional oversight and relied on deeply problematic alliances, including with South Africa's apartheid regime, and it failed to achieve its objective as the MPLA ultimately seized power and was internationally recognized. The exposure of CIA's role in Angola by the press would spark public backlash and led to the passing of the Clark Amendment in 1976, which prohibited further U.S. military assistance to groups in Angola, and the operation would become a cautionary tale of Cold War overreach and completely backfired diplomatically. In 1976, amidst the fallout of the Watergate Scandal and bombshell revelations of the Church Committee, President Gerald Ford would appoint George H.W. Bush as Director of Central Intelligence. At the time, public trust in the CIA had completely collapsed due to the uncovered evidence of illegal domestic spying, assassination plots, foreign election interference, and other abuses, and Bush, a former congressman, UN ambassador, and Republican Party chair, was brought in as a, quote, safe pair of hands to restore credibility to the agency, without threatening its core functions. He held the position for just under a year, and he implemented modest reforms intended to improve transparency and oversight. He created the CIA Office of Legislative Counsel to improve communication with Congress and encouraged a more accountable appearance in covert operations. However, despite his affable reputation and talk of reform, Bush did not fundamentally clean house. While he sought to reduce the political friction between the CIA and Congress, he largely protected personnel, also resisting deeper institutional reforms and helped preserve much of the pre-existing intelligence architecture. Bush's tenure was more about damage control than actual transformation, as it just stabilized the CIA's public image while ensuring that its core covert capabilities were preserved for future administrations. Cubana de Aviación Flight 455 was a commercial Cuban airliner that was bombed and destroyed on October 6, 1976, killing all 73 people on board, including members of Cuba's national fencing team, who had just won gold at the Central American and Caribbean Games. The flight had departed from Barbados en route to Havana via stops in Trinidad and Jamaica when two bombs detonated on board shortly after takeoff, causing the aircraft to crash into sea. Investigations quickly determined the attack was a terrorist bombing and turned attention to anti-Castro Cuban exiles linked to militant groups operating out of the United States and Central America. Hernan Ricardo Lozano and Freddy Lugo would be arrested in Trinidad after admitting to planting the bombs, and both would be connected to Luis Posada Correas and Orlando Bosch, two high-profile Cuban exiles with long-standing ties to the CIA and a history of violent anti-Castro activity. Luis Posada Correas, a former CIA-trained operative, and Orlando Bosch, a known militant with a record of bombings and assassination plots, plots would be accused of masterminding the attack, and declassified U.S. documents confirmed that Posada had been on the CIA's payroll intermittently from the 1960s to the early 1970s and remained in contact with American intelligence agencies even after that. Both men would be arrested in Venezuela after the bombing, but only Ricardo and Lugo were convicted. Posada would escape from prison in 1985, eventually resurfacing in Central America and later entering the United States, where extradition requests from both Cuba and Venezuela were repeatedly denied. The U.S. government's refusal to prosecute or extradite Posada and Bosch, despite their known involvement in the deaths of civilians, including children, sparked international outrage and allegations of American hypocrisy in its war on terror in Cuba, and many of the international community would label the bombing as an act of state-sponsored terrorism. On September 21st, 1976, Orlando Letelier, a former Chilean diplomat and vocal critic of Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet, would be assassinated in Washington, D.C. when a car bomb exploded under his vehicle, killing both him and Ronnie Carpin Moffett, an American colleague. This murder was carried out by agents of DINA, or Chile's secret police, under the umbrella of Operation Condor. Orlando had served as Chile's ambassador to the U.S. and later as defense minister under the democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende, who Augusto Pinochet overthrew in 1973, being backed by the CIA. And living in exile, Orlando became a prominent human rights advocate and worked at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, where he lobbied against U.S. aid to the Pinochet regime and exposed its abuses. Now, his assassination would mark one of the most brazen acts of foreign terrorism ever committed on U.S. soil and was the most high-profile act of Operation Condor outside of South America. Subsequent investigations by the FBI and congressional committees confirmed that the assassination had been ordered by Manuel Contreras, head of the DINA, and carried out by a team that included Michael Townley, an American expatriate and former DINA operative who had previously worked with or had contacts with the CIA. Though Michael Townley later entered witness protection after cooperating with U.S. authorities, the incident raised serious concerns about CIA's prior knowledge and complicity, and declassified documents revealed that U.S. intelligence agencies were aware, as early as mid-1976, that Operation Condor had planned to assassinate political dissidents abroad, including Orlando, but failed to issue a formal warning to him or take action to prevent any such attacks. Now, the official extent of CIA's foreknowledge remains debated, but the fact remains that the agency maintained ties with Latin American intelligence services, many of whom were active participants in Operation Condor, which all raised questions about the willingness to overlook human rights violations in favor of strategic alliances or anti-communism. In 1977, following the revelations of the Church Committee and mounting public concern over the CIA's unchecked power, investigative journalist Carl Bernstein published a bombshell expose titled "The CIA in the Media" in the Rolling Stone. Drawing from interviews with CIA officials and access to internal documents, Bernstein revealed that more than 400 American journalists had secretly worked with or for the CIA from the 1950s through the 1970s. These individuals included reporters, editors, columnists, correspondents, and even media executives at some of the most influential outlets in the country, including the New York Times, Time, Newsweek, CBS, ABC, and the Associated Press. According to Bernstein's reporting, some journalists were full-fledged CIA operatives who used their press credentials as cover for espionage, while others were recruited informants who passed along information, facilitated access, or allowed their work to be shaped by agency messaging. This secret collaboration, often retroactively nicknamed Operation Mockingbird in popular accounts, though the CIA never officially used the term, enabled the agency to manipulate both domestic and foreign news coverage. Through these covert relationships, the CIA could influence media narratives around Cold War policies, foreign coups, regime change, anti-communist propaganda, and suppress reporting on controversial agency operations like MKUltra, Operation TP Ajax, or involvement in Vietnam and Latin America. However, the CIA officially claimed that they ended these arrangements by 1976, when then Director George H.W. Bush issued an order forbidding the use of American journalists as assets in the official capacity. However, Bernstein and others pointed out that loopholes remained, especially for stringers, freelancers, and foreign correspondents. And Bernstein's expose would deepen public distrust in both the intelligence community and the press, highlighting how even democratic institutions could be quietly compromised in the name of national security or anti-communism. Project Stargate was a highly unconventional U.S. intelligence program launched in the late 1970s to explore the use of psychic phenomena, specifically remote viewing, as a tool for espionage. This project was born out of Cold War paranoia and reports that the Soviet Union was investing heavily in psychic research, including extrasensory perception, telekinesis, and mind control experiments. In response, the Defense Intelligence Agency and later the CIA sponsored a series of experiments under various codenames: Scangate, Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Sunstreak, and eventually Stargate, the program's final designation. Initially led by physicists Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ at the Stanford Research Institute, and later operated out of Fort Meade, Maryland, Stargate aimed to determine whether psychics could mentally, quote, see distant or hidden targets such as enemy bases, secret installations, or kidnapped hostages using only their minds. The unit included several self-described remote viewers, most infamously Ingo Swann, Pat Price, and Joseph McMonigal, who conducted hundreds of sessions attempting to describe targets they had never physically seen. These descriptions will be compared to satellite images, classified maps, or known intelligence to evaluate their accuracy. Over nearly 2 decades, the Stargate project remained a strange but persistent corner of U.S. intelligence landscape, operating with a small team and modest budget, but occasionally generating enough interest to earn temporary credibility with military and CIA leadership. Some of the more tantalizing anecdotes include remote viewers allegedly locating a drowned Soviet bomber in Africa, sketching the inside of a Soviet research facility, or describing the contents of sealed envelopes. However, despite these occasional hits, the overall results were inconsistent, vague, and often unverifiable. And in 1995, following a review by the American Institutes for Research, commissioned by the CIA, the program would be shut down. And the final assessment concluded that although some remote viewing results appeared statistically significant, no remote viewing report ever provided actionable information used in any intelligence operation. The CIA's connection to the 1978 Jonestown Massacre, orchestrated by Jim Jones and his People's Temple cult in Guyana, has long been the subject of intense speculation, as no direct operational role by the agency has been conclusively proven. However, certain factual elements suggest that U.S. intelligence was closely monitoring the group and possibly had overlapping interests in the region. The People's Temple, originally based in California, had drawn attention from federal authorities due to its rapid militarization, stockpiling of weapons, and increasingly authoritarian behavior of its leader. And after relocating over 900 followers to Guyana in 1977 to escape mounting legal and media scrutiny, the group established a commune called Jonestown in the country's remote northwest. Guyana, a Marxist-aligned country bordering Venezuela and Brazil, was of very strategic interest to the CIA during the Cold War. And although the U.S. Embassy in Georgetown officially handled the diplomatic affairs, the CIA maintained a presence in the area, particularly through embassy cover roles. Declassified documents confirm that the agency closely tracked Guyanese political developments, including local Marxist movements and U.S. citizen activity abroad, making it virtually certain that Jonestown was on their radar. Additionally, reports emerged that Richard Dwyer, deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Guyana, present during Congressman Leo Ryan's ill-fated 1978 visit to Jonestown that led to his death, had previous ties to the CIA, as listed on the 1968 Who's Who in the CIA publication, though the agency denies that he was an actual operative. On November 18th, 1978, after Congressman Leo Ryan and several others were ambushed and murdered by Temple gunmen at a nearby airstrip, over 900 people would die in Jonestown, primarily by ingesting cyanide-laced flavor aid, which was officially labeled as a mass murder. And while there is no confirmed evidence that the CIA orchestrated or even encouraged this tragedy, which I doubt it did, the agency's silence, limited preemptive action, and the broader geopolitical context have funneled enduring questions about their foreknowledge and possible psychological profiling interests, and the extent of their intelligence gathering operations involving People's Temple, particularly given the group's paramilitary structure, anti-American and borderline communist rhetoric, and Cold War geopolitical location. There's also conspiracy theories that Jim Jones was a CIA asset, but that's just a theory. A film theory. Oh. Operation Cyclone, launched in 1979, was one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in CIA history. Its objective was to support the Afghan Mujahideen in resisting the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which had begun in December 1979. Spearheaded by CIA Director William Casey and backed by the Reagan administration, the program funneled billions of dollars in arms, equipment, and financial aid to anti-Soviet guerrilla fighters. The operation was coordinated through Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, which served as the middleman for distributing US and Saudi funding to various Mujahideen forces. Weapons included Stinger missiles, explosives, and small arms, which dramatically improved the Mujahideen's ability to wage asymmetric warfare. The US would also work with Saudi Arabia to match American contributors dollar for dollar, and the Gulf monarchies would contribute further by funding religious schools that would go on to promote militant Islam. Now, this overarching US strategy was to turn Afghanistan into a Soviet Vietnam by bleeding the USSR into a prolonged, unwinnable conflict. While Operation Cyclone would ultimately help drive out Soviet forces by 1989, it had very, very serious unintended consequences. The US largely outsourced control of funds and arms to the ISI, which funneled disproportionate support to radical Islamist factions, and one of the foreign fighters who actually entered the war zone during these periods was Osama bin Laden, who used his connections and wealth to help build Maktab al-Khidmat, an organization that facilitated the arrival of other jihadist volunteers going to fight the Soviet Union, and whose groups would later evolve into Al-Qaeda. Although the CIA did not directly fund bin Laden, their empowerment of the broader Mujahideen network created the conditions for their rise to power. And after Soviet withdrawal, many of the CIA-trained fighters and their weapons remained in the region, contributing to the following civil war and eventual Taliban dominance, and the rise of transnational jihadist terrorism. Operation Cyclone is now widely cited as a classic case of blowback, a Cold War victory that helped create a far more dangerous post-Cold War threat. The October Surprise is a persistent conspiracy theory that alleges that members of Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign secretly negotiated with the Iranian government to delay the release of 52 American hostages held in Tehran until after the US election, thereby preventing President Jimmy Carter from securing electoral boosts. Now, according to this theory, campaign officials, including William Casey, or Reagan's campaign manager and the future CIA director, and George H.W. Bush, who was Reagan's running mate, allegedly met with Iranian intermediaries in Paris and Madrid in the summer and fall of 1980. In these supposed meetings, the Reagan camp offered Iran future arms sales and political recognition in exchange for ensuring that the hostages were not released before Election Day, thereby depriving Jimmy Carter of a diplomatic victory. Now, while the hostage crisis was one of the most critical issues of the 1980 campaign, the hostages were, in fact, released on January 20th, 1981, just minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in, and the suspicious timing of this fueled widespread speculation that some form of back-channel arrangement may have occurred. This theory would gain momentum in the late 1980s and early 1990s, particularly after the revelations of the Iran-Contra Affair, in which the Reagan administration had secretly sold arms to Iran in the mid-1980s, seemingly validating the idea of covert dealings with Tehran. Despite its enduring intrigue, no conclusive evidence has ever proven the October surprise allegations, and multiple investigations have failed to substantiate them. In October 1983, the United States launched a surprise military invasion of Grenada, dubbed Operation Urgent Fury, following a bloody coup on the island that deposed and executed Prime Minister Maurice Bishop. The CIA had been closely monitoring Grenada since the late 1970s after Bishop's New Jewel movement took power and aligned the country with Cuba and other Marxist states, and the US government grew increasingly concerned about Grenada's construction of a large airstrip, ostensibly for tourism, but viewed by the Reagan administration as potential Soviet or Cuban military infrastructure. After Maurice Bishop was killed by hardline Marxist factions in a violent power struggle struggle on October 19th, 1983, and a military junta took control, the U.S. claimed that American medical students on the island were in danger. Citing national security, the Reagan administration launched the invasion on October 25th, 1983, involving approximately 7,000 U.S. troops. And while the invasion itself was a Department of Defense operation, the CIA would also play a significant supporting role before and during the attack, as operatives had infiltrated the region leading up to the invasion, attempting to gather intelligence and assess the political instability. Now, the invasion succeeded within days, and the American students were evacuated safely. And this Grenada operation would mark the first U.S. military intervention since Vietnam and was viewed as a political and military success by the Reagan administration, even though it violated international law and was condemned by the UN General Assembly. However, for the CIA, Grenada was an opportunity for the agency to flex their paramilitary muscle. The Iran-Contra Affair was one of the most explosive political scandals in U.S. history, involving a covert operation that linked two highly controversial policies: secretly selling weapons to Iran, a designated enemy, and using the proceeds to illegally fund the Contras, a right-wing rebel group fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. The plan violated multiple U.S. laws and direct congressional bans. Despite an official arms embargo, senior officials in the Reagan administration, including National Security Council members like Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, facilitated the sale of weapons to Iran in hope of securing the release of American hostages held by Hezbollah in Lebanon. Meanwhile, Congress had passed the Boland Amendment, which explicitly prohibited U.S. government assistance to the Contras, whose brutal tactics, including attacks on civilians, assassinations, and drug trafficking, were drawing international condemnation. To circumvent this legal barrier, members of the administration diverted funds from the Iran arms sales to support the Contra operations, a maneuver that was kept hidden from Congress and the public. The CIA would play a critical logistical role in the affair, including the coordination of arms deliveries and financial transfers. The agency also helped set up the offshore shell companies and front organizations, facilitated weapons shipments through third parties, most notably Israel, and provided support to airlifts and military operations that were carried out by the Contras. Though the CIA was officially barred from aiding the Contras after 1984, they continued to engage indirectly using cutouts, contractors, and quote, plausible deniability strategies. Several CIA-linked aircraft were later revealed to have transported both weapons and narcotics, fueling the accusations that the agency had turned a blind eye to Contra drug trafficking into the U.S. in order to sustain their flow of funds. The scandal was exposed in late 1986 when a Lebanese magazine reported the arms sales to Iran, and investigative journalists and congressional inquiries soon unraveled the full story. The fallout led to multiple investigations, including the Tower Commission and congressional Iran-Contra hearings, which revealed a systemic pattern of deception. 14 administration officials were indicted, and several were convicted, including Oliver North and National Security Advisor John Poindexter, though most had their sentences overturned or were later pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. Yeah. In 1985, the CIA was linked to one of the most controversial covert operations of the Reagan era, a car bombing in Beirut, Lebanon, that was intended as a retaliation strike against Hezbollah and its suspected backers in Iran. This came after a wave of devastating attacks on U.S. targets in Lebanon, most notably the 1983 bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, which killed 241 American servicemen and was attributed to Hezbollah operatives with Iranian support. In response, elements within the Reagan administration approved more aggressive counterterrorism measures. On March 8, 1985, a massive car bomb exploded in the Bir al-Abed neighborhood, a densely populated Shia area in southern Beirut, very close to where Hezbollah leader Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah was believed to have lived. The bomb, estimating around 440 pounds, detonated near a mosque shortly after Friday prayers, killing over 80 civilians and injuring more than 200, yet Fadlallah survived. Although the CIA has denied direct involvement, numerous investigative reports, including from the Washington Post and statements from former intelligence officials, later revealed that the CIA operation had fingerprints, even if indirectly executed through Lebanese intelligence operatives and Saudi funding. The CIA had greenlit a plan to eliminate Fadlallah, though the resulting execution far exceeded the anticipated scope and civilian toll. Hezbollah used the bombing to justify further attacks on American targets, and the recruitment efforts would surge. The political fallout would reach Washington, where Congress and segments of the CIA were outraged by the unauthorized scope and poor oversight of the operation, and the failure to kill the target, combined with high civilian casualties, marked the Beirut Car bombing as a strategic and moral debacle. During the mid-1980s, as we discussed, the U.S. government covertly supported Contra rebels fighting the leftist Sandinista government in Nicaragua, and a scandal would begin brewing over reports that Contra-linked groups were funding their operations through cocaine trafficking, with the CIA allegedly ignoring, enabling, or even covering it up. Multiple sources, including a 1985 DEA cable, warned of cocaine shipments from Contra-associated networks, yet little to no action was taken. In 1986, even the Reagan administration acknowledged that some of the Contra factions were deeply involved in the drug trade, though officials insisted that they were isolated and unsanctioned actors. The logic was clear. As part of the Reagan-era war on communism, propping up anti-Sandinista forces would take priority, even if it meant ignoring the illicit activities of U.S.-aligned groups. The CIA's Inspector General's report in 1998 later confirmed that Contra supply networks and traffickers were indeed involved in smuggling cocaine into the United States, and that CIA personnel had contact with individuals involved. However, the agency still denied direct participation, claiming it neither encouraged nor profited from the trafficking. The controversy exploded into public consciousness in 1996 when investigative journalist Gary Webb published the Dark Alliance series in the San Jose Mercury News. Gary Webb alleged that CIA-connected Contra operatives had played a central role in flooding Los Angeles with crack cocaine, triggering the crack epidemic that devastated minority communities in the 1980s and 90s. He linked this network to dealers like Freeway Ricky Ross, whose cocaine supply traced back to Contra-affiliated traffickers. Gary Webb's work would ignite outrage in African-American neighborhoods, who felt it confirmed long-held suspicions of systemic government abuse. However, mainstream media outlets, including the Washington Post, New York Times, and the LA Times, swiftly worked to discredit his claims. Under intense pressure, Gary Webb's reputation would be destroyed, and he left journalism. And in 2004, Gary Webb would be found dead in his home with 2 gunshot wounds to the head, and his death was officially ruled a suicide. In 1985, DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena would be kidnapped, tortured, and murdered in Guadalajara, Mexico, after uncovering a massive marijuana operation linked to the Guadalajara cartel that was led by Rafael Caro Quintero, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, and Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. While his death was officially blamed on cartel retribution for a series of drug busts, growing evidence and testimony from former DEA agents, journalists, and insiders have poured into deeper, more disturbing connections that implicated elements of the CIA. According to investigative reports and statements by former DEA officials like Hector Bareles, Kiki Camarena had stumbled upon U.S. intelligence operations in Mexico that were allegedly permitting, or at least overlooking, drug trafficking activities in exchange for cartel cooperation in funding and arming the Nicaraguan Contras, the anti-communist rebel group that was covertly supported by the U.S. government during the Reagan administration. Hector Bareles and others claimed that CIA operatives were present during Kiki Camarena's interrogation, suggesting that his murder was not solely a cartel act, but potentially a silencing operation that was aimed to prevent exposure of U.S. complicity in drug-funded covert wars. Further controversy was fueled by the suspicious removal of Kiki Camarena's case from DEA control and reports of altered or suppressed forensic evidence. Of course, the CIA has denied any direct involvement, and the allegations remain persistent, with former Mexican police officers and cartel insiders alleging that Camarena's knowledge of illicit collaboration between U.S. intelligence and drug traffickers inevitably led to his betrayal and death. Though no official acknowledgement has confirmed CIA participation, the case remains one of the most contentious intersections of the drug war and covert Cold War operations, with the murder of a U.S. federal agent raising unresolved questions about the extent to which American intelligence agencies were willing to compromise law enforcement in order to pursue their geopolitical objectives. In 1987, we'd see the origin of the Finders case when police in Tallahassee, Florida, detained 2 well-dressed men traveling with 6 unkempt hungry children, raising suspicion of child abuse or kidnapping. The children, who appeared malnourished and unfamiliar with basic hygiene, told authorities they lived communally and were being taken to a school for, quote, smart children. The two men, Douglas Emmerman and Michael Houlihan, were part of a little-known group called the Finders, based in Washington, D.C. When authorities traced the men back to the group's properties, including a warehouse and a rural Virginia farm, they reportedly found computers, documents, photos of children, maps, and references to unorthodox child-raising practices. A 1987 U.S. Customs report described evidence as ritualistic behavior and raised suspicions of possible child exploitation or trafficking, and most controversially, the report stated that the CIA had become involved in the investigation, suggesting that some of the members of the Finders may have had ties to the agency, and that the investigation was declared a matter of national security. These cryptic references would later become the basis for the widespread suspicion that the CIA intervened to shut down or bury the case, as despite all the ominous claims, no charges were ever filed. Multiple agencies, including the FBI, Metropolitan Police Department of DC, and U.S. Customs, investigated the Finders and ultimately concluded there was no evidence of criminal activity. Authorities stated that while the group's lifestyle was unconventional and secretive, it appeared to be a fringe communal living experiment and not a criminal enterprise. The children were returned to their mothers, and the two men were released. Nonetheless, the case has lingered in conspiracy circles, and interest in the case surged again in 2019 when the FBI declassified hundreds of pages related to the Finders. The documents, as many of them were heavily redacted, revealed more about the internal investigations but did not confirm any CIA wrongdoing or evidence of trafficking. And the Finders remain an enduring fixture in deep state conspiracy lore, often viewed as the precursor to internet-era panics like Pizzagate and QAnon. Throughout the 1980s, the United States, under the Reagan administration's aggressive Cold War strategy, provided significant financial, logistical, and intelligence support to authoritarian regimes in Central America, particularly in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Framed as a broader campaign to combat leftist insurgencies and prevent the spread of communism, the support often involved backing regimes and military units that committed widespread human rights abuses, including torture, enforced disappearances, and extrajudicial killings. One of the most notorious examples was Honduras Battalion 316, a military intelligence unit trained and advised by the CIA, which carried out systematic abductions, torture, and assassinations of suspected dissidents and opposition figures. Declassified documents and testimonies have confirmed that CIA officers were present during interrogations, supplied intelligence equipment, and maintained close relationships with 316 commanders. In El Salvador, U.S. military and intelligence advisors, including CIA-linked personnel such as Colonel Nick Rowe, helped set up and train local intelligence services, which were later tied to death squad activity. While the U.S. officially condemned such abuses, its intelligence liaisons and funding streams continued unabated, leading to direct complicity in or facilitation of atrocities. The extent of U.S. involvement came under scrutiny after high-profile massacres and assassinations, such as the 1980 rape and murder of 4 American churchwomen in El Salvador, the killing of Archbishop Oscar Romero, and the El Mozote massacre in 1981, where over 800 civilians were slaughtered by U.S.-trained Salvadoran troops. In 1984, media exposés and congressional investigations began to publicly unravel the CIA's entanglements with these regimes, and multiple internal and external reviews concluded that the CIA failed to distance itself from, and in many cases actively empowered, state actors who committed war crimes. In Guatemala, similar patterns emerged where U.S. intelligence cooperation continued despite the government's genocidal campaigns against indigenous communities during the height of its civil war, and declassified CIA documents, including those released in the 90s and 2000s, confirmed the agency's intimate relationships with military units known for atrocities. These revelations became part of what historians and human rights groups now label as the U.S.'s dirty war complicity in Central America, which was a period when anti-communist ideology led to strategic alliances with death squads, resulting in tens of thousands of civilian deaths and long-lasting trauma in the region. Manuel Noriega, the military strongman of Panama, was for years a prized CIA asset before becoming one of Washington's most public betrayals. Rising through the ranks of Panama's military intelligence in the 1960s and 70s, Noriega began working with the CIA as early as 1967, providing information on leftist groups in Latin America and helping the U.S. track regional enemies during the Cold War. In exchange, the CIA protected and funded him, even as he engaged in human rights abuses and built a sprawling criminal enterprise. By the 1980s, Noriega had become the de facto ruler of Panama, running the country while maintaining the appearance of civilian governance. He proved useful to U.S. interests by supporting anti-Sandinista Contra operations in Nicaragua and allowing Panama to serve as a logistical hub for covert activities. However, Noriega was also deeply involved in drug trafficking, particularly cocaine shipments through Panama to the U.S., often working with Colombian cartels like the Medellin cartel. Despite growing evidence of his criminal activity, the U.S. government, especially under the Reagan administration, turned a blind eye due to his utility in Cold War geopolitics. However, by the late 1980s, Noriega had become a liability. He defied U.S. influence, voided democratic elections, suppressed opposition, and grew increasingly hostile towards American pressure. In 1988, a U.S. federal grand jury indicted him on drug trafficking and money laundering charges, but he remained in power, and tensions would escalate as Noriega allegedly encouraged anti-American riots and harassed U.S. military personnel stationed in the Panama Canal Zone. In December 1989, following the killing of a U.S. Marine and the failure of diplomatic efforts, President George H.W. Bush ordered Operation Just Cause, a massive U.S. invasion involving over 27,000 troops. Noriega would seek refuge in the Vatican Embassy in Panama City, where he was surrounded and bombarded with psychological warfare, including deafening rock music, until he finally surrendered on January 3rd, 1990. He was flown to Miami, convicted in U.S. court, and sentenced to 40 years in prison for drug trafficking, racketeering, and conspiracy. This invasion was criticized internationally as a breach of sovereignty, but in the U.S., it was largely portrayed as a successful removal of a rogue dictator. Ironically, the man America had once propped up had become a symbol of how Cold War alliances with corrupt strongmen could backfire. Noriega's fall exposed the hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, allying with criminal regimes so long as they served American interests, only to discard them when they no longer complied. During the 1991 Gulf War, also known as Operation Desert Storm, the CIA played a confirmed and largely supporting role in aiding U.S. military operations to drive Iraqi forces out of Kuwait, which had been invaded by Saddam Hussein in August of 1990. CIA analysts provided intelligence on Iraqi troop positions, Scud missile deployments, and critical infrastructure, helping guide coalition airstrikes and battlefield maneuvers during the war's brief but intense combat phase. However, the CIA's more controversial role would come after the war. In the final days of combat and following the US-led coalition's victory, CIA-run radio broadcasts, particularly through the Free Voice of Iraq, began urging the Iraqi people, especially the Shia population in the south and Kurds in the north, to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. These broadcasts gave the impression that the US would support such uprisings, sparking mass revolts across Iraq in March of 1991. The CIA also reportedly had existing contacts with Kurdish factions and Iraqi dissidents and was involved in information campaigns designed to destabilize Saddam's regime from within. However, when these uprisings materialized, the US did not intervene militarily to assist them. Bush's administration, despite its prior rhetorical encouragement, feared that direct involvement could lead to civil war, regional destabilization, or the breakup of Iraq, undermining US interests and possibly empowering Iran. As a result, while Shia rebels in the south and Kurdish fighters in the north briefly took control of several cities, Saddam's forces, especially the elite Republican Guard, would crush the uprisings with brutal force, resulting in the mass execution, torture, and displacement of tens of thousands of Iraqis. The CIA was later criticized for inciting rebellion without offering protection or follow-through, essentially leaving vulnerable populations exposed to retaliation. And human rights organizations and military analysts also questioned why the CIA and U.S. intelligence community failed to predict the scale of post-war instability, including Saddam's swift recovery and the humanitarian crisis that followed. This episode not only shattered U.S. credibility among Iraqi dissidents and civilians, but also planted seeds of long-term mistrust, thereby complicating future efforts to build local alliances and contributing to the geopolitical entanglements that would culminate in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing, which occurred on February 26, 1993, was the first major terrorist attack on the Twin Towers. It had a 1,200-pound urea nitrate hydrogen gas bomb, and the blast killed 6 people and injured over 1,000 and caused extensive damage, though it failed to achieve the attacker's goal of toppling the North Tower into the South Tower to kill tens of thousands. The plot was orchestrated by a cell linked to Ramzi Youssef, who was trained in terrorist camps in Afghanistan and arrived to the U.S. just months before the attack. Several co-conspirators, including Mohammed Salameh, Nadal Ayad, and Mahmoud Abu Halima, were arrested and convicted. The FBI and other intelligence agencies were caught off guard, raising immediate concerns about domestic vulnerabilities and the threat of international terrorism on American soil. And it was one of the first major wake-up calls about how Al-Qaeda-style networks weren't yet understood by U.S. policymakers. Controversy arose when it was revealed that Ahmad Salem, a former Egyptian officer and paid FBI informant, infiltrated radical Islamist groups in New York and worked closely with the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force. And according to transcripts of recorded conversations and court testimony, he had warned the FBI about the possibility of a bombing months in advance and allegedly suggested that he could help sabotage the bomb-making effort by supplying fake explosives. These revelations fueled speculation that the FBI had advance warning of the plot but failed to act decisively, either out of incompetence or that they were trying to build a bigger case. And while the official stance maintains that there was no deliberate allowance of the attack, the FBI's use of Salem, the alleged mishandling of intelligence, and the secrecy surrounding the informant's role have all led to persistent conspiracy theories and distrust. The 1993 bombing was not only a precursor to 9/11, but also a controversial case in the history of U.S. counterterrorism. The 1994 Rwanda Genocide, in which an estimated 800,000 Tutsi and moderate Hutu were slaughtered in just 100 days, stands as one of the most damning examples of international inaction and a confirmed intelligence failure by the CIA. Declassified documents and testimony from former officials revealed that U.S. intelligence agencies, including the CIA, had detailed knowledge of the genocide's planning well before it began. As early as January 1994, the U.S. had received reports from United Nations peacekeepers, particularly from Canadian General Romeo Dallaire, head of the UN Assistance Mission for Rwanda. Dallaire had famously warned of arms caches, hit lists, and planned extermination campaigns by Hutu extremists, and his cable, later dubbed the Genocide Facts, was sent to the UN and indirectly reached U.S. intelligence channels. Furthermore, a CIA briefing from 1994 warned of potential mass violence, stating that if fighting breaks out, hundreds of thousands will die. Despite this, the U.S. took no significant preventative action, and instead, Washington refused to call the crisis a genocide and publicly downplayed the situation and actively pushed for the withdrawal of UN peacekeeping forces just as the killing intensified in April. The decision to not intervene was influenced by a combination of bureaucratic paralysis, political caution, and post-Somalia syndrome, as this was the reluctance to get involved in African conflicts following the disastrous 1993 Black Hawk Down incident in Mogadishu. President Bill Clinton's administration feared another military disaster and chose to prioritize non-intervention, even instructing State Department officials to avoid using the term genocide. Later investigations, including a 1998 U.S. government report commissioned by the Clinton administration, acknowledged the failure, as the United States government did not act to prevent or stop the killings or to save lives once the genocide began. And in 2017, further declassified documents showed that top U.S. officials were briefed in real time about the scales of atrocities, yet remained committed to non-involvement. In 1996, the U.S. government declassified a series of explosive documents revealing that the CIA had produced and distributed training manuals in Latin America that promoted torture, coercion, and extrajudicial killings. These manuals dated back to the 1960s and 80s, during a period where the U.S. was deeply involved in counterinsurgency efforts across Central and South America. The first manual, Kubark Counterintelligence Interrogation, dated July 1963, is the source of many of the material in the second manual, and Kubark was a U.S. Central Intelligence acronym for the CIA itself, and this is one of the oldest manuals, as it describes the use of abusive techniques, exemplified by references to the use of electric shock, the use of threats, fear, sensory deprivation, and isolation. Most controversial of these was the Human Resource Exploitation Training Manual of 1983, which was used at the U.S. Army School of the Americas, a training center for Latin American military and police personnel located in Fort Benning, Georgia.
Since 1946, the U.S. Army has trained 58,000 Latin American soldiers at the School of the Americas, all paid for by the U.S. taxpayer.
The manual advised on interrogation tactics that included threats, sensory deprivation, forced nudity, use of drugs, and even execution scenarios. While the CIA claimed in public statements that such practices were meant to be theoretical or warned against in context, many sections read as guidelines rather than cautions. The release of these manuals confirmed long-standing allegations from human rights groups that the U.S. had actively trained Latin American forces in repressive tactics under the guise of anti-communist strategy. The fallout was significant, as these revelations connected the CIA to brutal regimes and death squads operating in El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and Chile, among others. In countries like El Salvador and Guatemala, where civil wars and military dictatorships were marked by disappearances, massacres, and torture, the U.S. trained forces were often the perpetrators. While the CIA tried to distance itself, stating that they had discontinued the use of these materials in the late 1980s, the 1996 disclosures confirmed that the agency had knowingly disseminated torture tactics as a part of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, all in the name of anti-communism. The 1999 Kosovo War marked a turning point in U.S. covert and military strategy, representing one of the first confirmed integrations of CIA personnel into an active NATO combat operation. The conflict erupted after years of ethnic tension and repression in the Serbian province of Kosovo, where the Kosovo Liberation Army, or KLA, a rebel group composed mostly of ethnic Albanians, had launched an armed insurgency against Slobodan Milosevic's Yugoslav or Serbian regime. As Serbian forces intensified their campaign of ethnic cleansing, mass killings, and forced deportations against Albanian civilians, NATO launched a 78-day air campaign beginning in March 1999 to halt the violence. Behind the scenes, CIA operatives were already on the ground, having been deployed to gather real-time intelligence on Serbian troop positions, weapon depots, and infrastructure. These teams played a direct role in feeding targeting information to NATO pilots, effectively turning the CIA into a forward deployed force within the larger military apparatus. And in addition to coordinating with NATO, the CIA worked closely with the KLA, despite the group's controversial background. Prior to the war, the KLA had been labeled by Western intelligence agencies as a terrorist organization due to its attacks on Serbian police and civilians. However, during the conflict, the CIA provided the KLA with training, communications equipment, and tactical guidance to assist with reconnaissance and sabotage missions against Serbian targets. This alliance was driven by less ideological alignment and more by shared objectives, that being removing Milosevic's forces from Kosovo. The war culminated in June 1999 with the withdrawal of Serbian troops, the entry of NATO peacekeepers, and the establishment of a UN administration in Kosovo. While the CIA's involvement was viewed by some in Washington as a success, it would also raise serious questions about legality, transparency, and precedent, particularly regarding the use of intelligence agencies to engage in direct military coordination and work with insurgent groups. Nevertheless, the Kosovo intervention set a model for future CIA roles in conflict, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria. In 2000, we'd see Operation Merlin, and this was a CIA covert operation launched with the goal of sabotaging Iran's nuclear weapons program by providing flawed technical information disguised as legitimate help. The operation centered around a former Russian nuclear engineer who was recruited by the CIA to deliver blueprints for a key component of a nuclear weapon to Iranian officials. The idea was to exploit Iran's desire for nuclear advancement by baiting them with flawed designs, which would result in technological setbacks, and the blueprints were intentionally seeded with errors, but constructed well enough to appear authentic. Now, this operation took place during a period of increasing U.S. concern over Iran's nuclear ambitions. However, Operation Merlin backfired. According to reports first revealed by investigative journalist James Risen in his 2006 book, State of War, the Russian scientist noted the technical flaws in the documents and warned the Iranians in the cover letter that he delivered, essentially alerting them that the plans may be flawed or deliberately sabotaged. This action completely compromised the entire operation, and the plan will be condemned as reckless and poorly executed, raising concerns that the operation may have accelerated Iran's nuclear capabilities rather than hindered them. And it also became a focal point in the prosecution of Jeffrey Sterling, a former CIA officer who was accused of leaking details of the operation to journalist James Risen. The September 11th, 2001 attacks, in which 19 al-Qaeda operatives hijacked 4 commercial airliners, killing nearly 3,000 people, exposed a catastrophic failure of the U.S. intelligence community, particularly the CIA and FBI. Prior to the attacks, the CIA had been actively monitoring 2 of the future hijackers, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midar, due to their attendance at a 2000 al-Qaeda summit in Malaysia. Despite tracking them to the United States in early 2000, the CIA failed to notify the FBI, which was responsible for domestic counterterrorism, and this omission prevented the FBI from placing them on watch lists or tracking their movements, despite both men living openly in California for over a year. Meanwhile, other intelligence fragments such as warnings from foreign governments, flight school suspicions, and previous al-Qaeda-linked plots were not synthesized or acted upon. And the 2004 9/11 Commission report concluded that the system was blinking red, yet intelligence and law enforcement agencies failed to communicate, share leads, or understand the gravity of the threat. In the aftermath of the attacks, the CIA was rapidly granted sweeping new authorities to wage covert war against al-Qaeda and its affiliates, and President George W. Bush signed the presidential finding shortly after 9/11, authorizing the CIA to conduct lethal operations worldwide, also marking the beginning of what became known as the Global War on Terror. The agency played a central role in the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, deploying paramilitary teams from the CIA's Special Activities Division to hunt down al-Qaeda leadership and assist U.S. Special Forces in toppling the Taliban regime. And these aggressive post-9/11 operations would fundamentally transform the CIA from an intelligence-gathering agency to an unprecedented hybrid of spy service, paramilitary force, and counter-terrorist strike arm. And while many plots were disrupted in the years that followed, the early intelligence lapses that enabled 9/11 remain one of the most profound failures in modern American history. Extraordinary rendition, a covert practice revived and expanded after the September 11th, 2001 attacks, involved the abduction and transfer of terrorism suspects to countries where they could be detained, interrogated, and often tortured, all while circumventing U.S. and international legal protections. The CIA, with authorization from the Bush administration, operated a global rendition network that transported detainees via secret flights to so-called black sites, undisclosed prisons operated outside U.S. soil or in cooperation with foreign intelligence agencies. These facilities were located in countries including Poland, Romania, Lithuania, Egypt, Jordan, Afghanistan, and Thailand, many of which had more permissive or non-existent laws against torture. At least 119 individuals are confirmed to have been subjected to this system, with many more suspected, and flights were conducted under the guise of private contractors to obscure CIA involvement. Detainees were often kidnapped from the streets of Europe, the Middle East, or South Asia, and held incommunicado for months or years, and subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques like waterboarding, stress positions, sleep deprivation, and physical assault. This program operated with little oversight until its exposure in the mid-2000s, leading to intense global and domestic backlash. Investigative journalism, whistleblowers, and lawsuits helped unravel the details of the rendition network, and in 2006, President George W. Bush publicly acknowledged the existence of CIA black sites, but defended them as essential to national security. Subsequent investigations, most notably the U.S. Intelligence Committee's 2014 report, revealed that the program was not only ineffective in producing actionable intelligence, but also routinely violated human rights and relied on deceptive reporting to government officials. And some of the detainees were later found to have no ties to terrorism whatsoever. Several European courts ruled that CIA operations violated their country's laws, with Poland, Lithuania, and Macedonia found complicit in abuses by the European Court of Human Rights. Despite calls for accountability, very few officials were ever prosecuted, and the program's architects, like CIA contractor James Mitchell, defended their actions as legal under the post-9/11 framework. The 2001 Peru Cessna 185 shootdown was a tragic and highly controversial incident resulting from a joint U.S.-Peruvian anti-narcotics operation that mistakenly targeted a civilian aircraft. On April 20th, 2001, a Cessna 185 float plane, operated by American Baptist missionaries Jim and Veronica Bowers, was flying over the Amazon basin en route to Peru with their 2 children aboard. The flight had been properly filed and was flying a known route. However, as part of a counter-narcotics program run by the CIA in coordination with the Peruvian Air Force, the aircraft was misidentified as a potential drug smuggling flight. A CIA surveillance plane shadowing the Cessna relayed its location to Peruvian military authorities, who then scrambled a Peruvian jet to intercept, and the Peruvian jet would end up opening fire without sufficient confirmation, striking the Cessna and causing it to crash into the Amazon River. The shoot-down killed Veronica Bowers and her infant daughter Charity. The incident drew immediate international outrage and led to a temporary suspension of the CIA's air interdiction program in South America, which had been in place since the mid-1990s as part of the broader U.S. war on drugs. A subsequent investigation by both the U.S. and Peruvian governments uncovered serious flaws in the rules of engagement, communication breakdowns, and repeated procedural violations. And the event remains a sobering example of the dangers inherent in covert and military collaborations, especially when civilian oversight, due diligence, and safeguards are compromised in the pursuit of broader geopolitical goals like, anti-drugs. In 2003, the U.S. government launched the invasion of Iraq, under the central claim that Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, including biological, chemical, and possibly nuclear weapons. This assertion, promoted by top Bush administration officials, was largely based on flawed or manipulated intelligence from CIA and other agencies. The most prominent justification was the claim that Iraq had attempted to acquire uranium from Niger, along with allegations that Iraq retained mobile biological weapons labs and stockpiles of banned chemical agents. These claims were presented in Secretary of State Colin Powell's speech to the United Nations on February 5, 2003, where he showed satellite images and intelligence reports that, in hindsight, lacked credibility or had even been outright fabricated. The whole predetermined policy goal of this was just a regime change in Iraq. And after U.S. invasion in March 2003, an extensive investigation failed to find any active weapons of mass destruction programs or stockpiles in Iraq, and the Iraq Survey Group, which conducted a massive post-invasion search, concluded in 2004 that Iraq had abandoned its weapons of mass destruction programs in the 1990s and had not resumed them. The absence of weapons shattered the public justification for war and led to significant loss of credibility for both the CIA and Bush administration. And in response, the 2005 Rob Silberman Commission and Senate Intelligence Committee found that the intelligence community's assessments were dead wrong and plagued by groupthink, lack of rigorous analysis, and poor vetting of sources. The fallout from this scandal severely damaged America's global standing and intensified skepticism towards U.S. foreign policy, and even contributed to the prolonged instability in Iraq, which would give rise to insurgencies and the eventual emergence of ISIS. In 2006, we'd see Operation Fast and Furious, which was not initiated by the CIA, but by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or ATF. And this was a controversial law enforcement operation that allowed thousands of firearms to be sold illegally with the intent of tracking the weapons to Mexican drug cartels. While it was officially overseen by the ATF's Phoenix office, subsequent investigations and whistleblower reports raised concerns about the involvement or knowledge of other U.S. intelligence agencies, including the CIA, as the operation permitted guns, including high-powered assault rifles, to walk across the border into Mexico, ostensibly to monitor cartel distribution networks. However, the weapons were rarely tracked successfully and turned up at hundreds of crime scenes, both in Mexico and the U.S., including the December 2010 murder of U.S. Border Patrol agent Brian Terry. This operation completely failed. They essentially just handed weapons over to these cartels. However, I'd like to acknowledge the CIA has not confirmed any formal participation, nor have they been technically found having any involvement in this. But yeah, it was, I thought it would be interesting to include. In December 2007, it was publicly revealed that the National Security Agency had been conducting warrantless surveillance of American citizens in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, running a program known as Stellar Wind. Authorized by President George W. Bush under a classified executive order shortly after 9/11, Stellar Wind enabled the NSA to bypass the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court and monitor phone calls, emails, and internet activity of individuals inside the United States without warrants. While officially an NSA operation, Stellar Wind was part of a broader interagency framework that included the CIA, FBI, and Department of Justice. According to later testimony and internal documents, the CIA played a supporting role in analyzing and coordinating the use of data collected by the NSA, especially in efforts to locate terrorist operatives or financial networks. This coordination was conducted through fusion centers and joint task forces, often blurring the lines between foreign and domestic intelligence gathering, which is illegal for the CIA to do. And the government operated in secrecy until whistleblower Thomas Tamm leaked its existence, followed by the New York Times reporters James Risen and Eric Lichtblau, igniting a national debate over privacy and executive overreach. The full scale and technical leaks of these surveillance activities only became fully clear after Edward Snowden's 2013 leaks, which revealed the extent of U.S. intelligence agencies' global data collection programs. Snowden's disclosures confirmed that the CIA was not merely a passive consumer of NSA data, but that they had participated directly in bulk data analysis and even operated parallel programs through private contractors and foreign partnerships. Programs like PRISM, XKeyscore, and the Muscular showed cooperation between NSA, CIA, and tech companies to vacuum up vast amounts of data, often without user consent or meaningful oversight. These revelations, of course, sparked public backlash, congressional investigations, and legal challenges, and in response, the USA Freedom Act of 2015 was passed, which ended the NSA's bulk collection of domestic telephony metadata, shifting data retention to telecom providers and requiring court orders for access. However, it would be later revealed in 2021 that the CIA maintained its own bulk data collection program, operating under executive authority without direct congressional approval or court oversight. Yes, they are trying to protect their citizens, but it's really just a paradox, as protecting the citizens to the fullest extent requires them to know everything about their citizens. Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting issue. Beginning under President George W. Bush and vastly expanding during President Barack Obama's administration, CIA drone strikes became a core tool in the U.S. counterterrorism arsenal, particularly in countries where the U.S. was not officially at war: Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. These covert operations were primarily conducted by CIA's Special Activities Division and often operated in legal gray zones, with little transparency or congressional oversight. In 2009, a CIA drone strike in Yemen targeted and killed Saleh al-Somali, a senior al-Qaeda figure, but the strike also resulted in the deaths of several civilians, foreshadowing a pattern of high-value targeting mixed with collateral damage. The Obama administration's growing reliance on drones reflected a strategy shift, favoring surgical precision strikes to decapitate terrorist leadership without deploying large numbers of troops. Drone warfare would become a hallmark of Obama's foreign policy, credited with killing hundreds of suspected militants, but also criticized for its secretive nature, lack of accountability, and civilian casualties. The Khost bombing on December 30th, 2009 was one of the CIA's most devastating operational failures in modern history, and the deadliest attack on CIA personnel since the 1983 Beirut embassy bombing. The attacker, Humam Khalil Abu Malal al-Balawi, was a Jordanian physician and al-Qaeda double agent who had been recruited by Jordanian intelligence and shared with the CIA as a high-value source. Al-Balawi had convinced both Jordanian and American intelligence agencies that he had infiltrated al-Qaeda's upper ranks and could deliver critical information about Ayman al-Zawahiri, al-Qaeda's second-in-command. CIA officials were convinced of his value, and al-Balawi was invited to forward operating base Chapman in Khost, Afghanistan, and he was allowed entry without being searched, and upon arrival at the base, he detonated a side vest, instantly killing 7 CIA officers, 1 Jordanian intelligence officer, and 1 security contractor, while wounding several others. The attack exposed significant flaws in the CIA's human intelligence tradecraft, especially its heavy reliance on sources provided by foreign intelligence services and the pressures to produce results in the hunt for high-value terrorist targets. In 2010, the whistleblower organization WikiLeaks, founded by Julian Assange, released a series of massive classified document dumps that exposed previously hidden U.S. military and CIA operations, sparking a global firestorm of controversy. The leaks begin with the collateral murder video in April 2010 showing a 2007 U.S. Apache helicopter attack in Baghdad that killed 11 civilians, including 2 Reuters journalists, footage that had been previously suppressed. This was followed by the Iraq war logs, Afghanistan war logs, and the Cablegate releases, consisting of over 250,000 U.S. diplomatic cables. The documents revealed not only alleged U.S. war crimes such as torture of detainees and cover-ups of civilian casualties and collaboration with corrupt local forces, but also widespread covert intelligence activities. Of particular concern were cables showing the CIA's involvement in rendition flights and secret paramilitary operations, and intelligence gathering on foreign politicians, UN officials, and human rights groups, all activities that the U.S. had publicly denied or downplayed. The leaks deeply embarrassed Washington, prompting the Obama administration to condemn the disclosures as threats to national security. However, human rights groups and press freedom advocates hailed the leaks as a critical window into the real mechanisms of U.S. foreign policy and covert power projection. In response, the U.S. launched a criminal investigation, eventually arresting Chelsea Manning, the Army intelligence analyst who leaked the documents, and Manning was sentenced to 35 years in prison, which was later commuted, and Assange will become the target of an international legal battle that continues to this day. In 2011, the CIA orchestrated a fake vaccination campaign in Pakistan as part of its effort to confirm the location of Osama bin Laden, who was believed to have been hiding in a compound in the city. The agency enlisted the help of a Pakistani physician to lead the operation under the guise of administering free hepatitis B vaccinations to local residents, and the true aim was to obtain DNA samples from children within the compound suspected of housing bin Laden and his family, thereby verifying their presence. The plan was to match the DNA with known samples from bin Laden's relatives, and to provide cover, the campaign was launched in a poorer neighborhood of Abbottabad, Pakistan, before moving closer to the bin Laden compound. However, the effort did not ultimately yield any conclusive DNA evidence. News of the fake vaccination plot broke following bin Laden's death. The Taliban and other militant groups in Pakistan and Afghanistan used the incident as evidence that Western vaccination efforts were fronts for espionage, and vaccination campaigns in the region were severely disrupted. The Pakistani government arrested the physician, Dr. Shakil Afridi, sentencing him to 33 years in prison. Operation Timber Sycamore, launched in 2015 but developed as early as 2013, was a covert CIA program to arm, train, and fund Syrian rebel factions fighting against the regime of Bashar al-Assad during the Syrian civil war. The program was authorized under the Obama administration and coordinated closely with intelligence services from regional allies such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Turkey, and Qatar. Timber Sycamore aimed to counter Assad's growing dominance and to put pressure on the regime through indirect means rather than committing U.S. forces directly to the conflict. And the CIA would train thousands of fighters from selected Syrian opposition groups, providing them with small arms, anti-tank missiles, cash, and logistical support. However, this became quickly controversial, and its outcomes were deeply mixed at best and counterproductive. While the CIA attempted to vet rebel groups, many of the factions it armed either fragmented, cooperated with extremist groups, or lost weapons to al-Qaeda affiliates like Jabhat al-Nusra or even ISIS. Most notably, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, a Sunni Islamist political organization and paramilitary group involved in the Syrian civil war, will become one of the dominating factions in the region, launching an offensive in 2024 that led to the fall of the Assad regime on December 8th. And keep in mind, this was a group that the CIA had helped finance. Even though the operation was shut down officially in 2017, the damage had already been done by now. And ironically, on July 7th, 2025, the United States would revoke the foreign terrorist designation of HTS, as they would become internationally recognized as the new government of Syria. And I've talked about this in the ISIS video. After they took power, they were going around committing ethnic cleansing against Alawites in Syria who had benefited from Assad's regime. And one of the most ironic things about this is that this was happening for a while. Like, this wasn't new. Different organizations were calling it borderline genocide. But for some reason, the whole scenario has been blown out of proportion in recent weeks when I'm talking about this. All of a sudden, it seems like different foreign governments are starting to actually give a shit about what happened. But I don't know. So we'll see what happens in Syria. Now, while there's no confirmed official connection between Jeffrey Epstein and the CIA, his mysterious wealth, political connections, and access to elite circles have fueled persistent speculation about ties to intelligence agencies, including the CIA, Mossad, and others. Epstein, a financier and convicted sex offender, was first investigated in the early 2000s for sexually abusing underage girls, yet avoided any serious punishment through a controversial plea deal that was negotiated by then U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta. The deal allowed Epstein to serve just 13 months in the private wing of a Florida jail with work release privileges, despite evidence suggesting a much broader sex trafficking operation. Years later, Alex Acosta would tell Trump administration officials that he was told to back off Epstein because he, quote, belonged to intelligence and that the issue was above his, quote, pay grade. According to Acosta, he was pushed to give him a good deal, and it was also noted that former CIA director and diplomat William J. Burns met with Epstein 3 times. This would all add fuel to the theory that Epstein may have worked with or for intelligence agencies, possibly entrapping powerful individuals through blackmail in service of espionage or leverage. Further suspicions were raised due to Epstein's long-standing associations with elite figures in politics, academia, and business, including Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, Ehud Barak, and even Harvard and MIT faculty. The secrecy would deepen after Epstein was rearrested in 2019 on federal sex trafficking charges and later died in jail under highly controversial circumstances. The official ruling was suicide by hanging, and this was met with widespread public skepticism due to the jail's broken cameras, absent guards, and Epstein's connections to so many influential people. However, no conclusive evidence has ever been made public linking Epstein directly to any intelligence agency. In 2021, a bombshell investigation would reveal that the CIA, under Director Mike Pompeo, had developed detailed plans in 2017 to kidnap or assassinate WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange while he was living under asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And CIA officials floated extreme measures, including kidnapping Assange off the streets in London, engaging in shootouts with Russian agents who they feared might help him escape, crashing cars, or even planning a potential assassination if Assange attempted to flee. The CIA would of course ramp up their surveillance of Assange inside the Ecuadorian embassy, reportedly bugging his conversations, monitoring visits, and infiltrating security firms tasked with protecting him. And these revelations reignited debates over the limits of intelligence operations, press freedom, and the treatment of whistleblowers and leakers. Though Assange was eventually arrested by British authorities in 2019 and faces possible extradition to the US on espionage-related charges, this report laid bare how far the CIA was willing to go to silence a figure it saw as a profound threat. As of 2025, the Central Intelligence Agency's relationship with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, remains one of the more opaque but increasingly scrutinized intersections within the federal security apparatus. Although the CIA is legally prohibited from domestic law enforcement or surveillance under the National Security Act of 1947, the post-9/11 security state has seen blurred jurisdictional lines and growing culture of intelligence sharing between traditionally separate agencies, and no laws have ever stopped the CIA from operating domestically ever. It's been reported that Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, has contracted a private security firm run by former CIA associates to train ICE officers in intelligence collection and counterterrorism elicitation, and documents indicate that the training is to help ICE officers collect information from, quote, terrorist suspects. As we know, ICE is a very popular subject in the United States. They have long partnered with the DEA, ATF, and FBI in multi-agency raids and investigations, and the CIA's behind-the-scenes support, particularly in foreign intelligence gathering, has only deepened the ethical gray zone. It's argued that the CIA's contributions, especially in identifying foreign targets that are later detained by ICE or the DEA, circumvent due process and violate the spirit of laws designed to keep intelligence and domestic policing separate. Nonetheless, immigration enforcement, community raids, and, quote, cartel-linked arrests have intensified in recent years and has led many civil liberty advocates to question whether the post-9/11 expansion of U.S. intelligence capabilities have permanently eroded the boundaries between espionage and policing. But yeah, that's all we're going to be talking about today. The biggest question is, what don't we know that is happening right now? What could the CIA be doing today that we won't find out about until decades down the line? Could they be experimenting with AI-driven psychological operations, run across different social media platforms to influence people when it comes to certain elections or political ideals? Could they be fucking around with Iran or even funding more insurgency groups in Syria or in other countries across the world. Now, some of this stuff sounds crazy, like it's completely conspiratorial, and I sound borderline schizophrenic talking about it. And I just want to emphasize, the point of this video was not to villainize individuals or villainize the United States as a country, or even dismiss national security. However, it's important to remember that unchecked power, no matter who holds it, will always find a way to operate in the dark. And that's why we, me and you, need to keep asking questions and keep history alive and make sure that we learn from history and not repeat it. But yeah, that's about it. I'm really excited about this year. It's been a great year for the channel. Without people like you watching the videos, I don't know, I wouldn't be here, you know what I mean? But yeah, hope you're doing well. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. I love you, bro.